Good morning and welcome to the November 2022 board meeting of the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, or the MHRA as we prefer to call ourselves. My name is Stephen Lightfoot and I'm the chair of the board, and my role today is to lead us through the agenda. Now, for those of you who've not attended one of our meetings before, I must start by saying that this is a board meeting held in public and it is not a public meeting. It's also important to explain that the board is responsible for agreeing the strategic direction of the agency, maintaining high standards of corporate governance, and also scrutinising the performance of the MHRA, which is something that we will be doing today. But also making it really clear that this board is not involved in making any individual regulatory decisions on any specific medicines, medical devices, or blood products. And that's because the regulatory decisions themselves are made and recommended to ministers by our MHRA officials, who themselves are independent civil servants. And they also take advice from our expert advisory committees, such as the Commission on Human Medicines. So the role of regulation is very clearly separated between that function and the function of this board. Now, as far as this meeting is concerned, I also need to make you aware that we're live streaming the meeting and also recording it today as well. So we can publish the video on our website. And that gives us as many people as the opportunity to watch what we do as possible. Now, on that note, I'm particularly pleased to say that we've got 127 people have registered to observe our meeting live today, with 75 members of the public or representatives of patient groups. We've got 25 people from industry, 7 healthcare professionals, 4 journalists, and 16 members of staff. So a very warm welcome to you on this November morning. So thank you for joining us. Now, with introductions in mind, I'd just like to go around the room and ask my colleagues on the board to introduce themselves so that you all know their name and their job role on the boards. So, as I said, my name's Stephen Lightfoot and I'm the chair of the board. June, over to you.
Good morning, my name's June Rain and I'm the CEO of MHRA.
Good morning, my name's Natalie Richards, I'm the head of the Executive Office.
Good morning, Haider Hussain, Non-Executive Director.
Good morning, Mandy Calvert, Non-Exec Director.
Good morning, Alison Cave, Chief Safety Officer, MHRA.
Good morning, Raj Long, Non-Executive Director. Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Laura Squire. I'm Chief Healthcare Quality and Access Officer for the MHRA.
Good morning, Paul Goldsmith, Non-Executive Director.
Good morning, Claire Harrison, Chief Digital and Technology Officer.
Good morning, Michael Whitehouse, Non-Executive Director.
Good morning, Mercy Jersingham, Non-Executive Director.
Good morning, Mark Bailey, Chief Science and Innovation Officer.
Good morning, I'm Rachel Bosworth, I'm Director of Communications and Engagement.
Good morning, Catherine Glover, Deputy Director, Medicines Regulation and Prescribing at the Department of Health and Social Care.
And we're also joined online today by another colleague. So Graham, do you want to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, morning, Graham Cook, Non-Executive Director.
Thank you very much for joining us today. Okay, so you should all have access to the board pack of papers for today's meeting. And I'll use the page numbers on the board pack to keep us all on track. I'll also assume that everyone has read the papers so we can spend most of our time on discussion rather than presentation. Now, although this is not a public meeting, we will provide an opportunity for members of the public to ask any questions about the items on the agenda. And this can be done using the chat function on the Zoom webinar that people will be watching today. Our Director of Communications, Rachel Bosworth, will collate the questions and will answer as many of the questions that are related to the agenda live in the meeting at the end of today. And those questions that are either not related to the agenda or we don't have time for, we'll actually guarantee to give a written response within the next 18 days as part of our normal way of wanting to engage with the public. So that's the intention of how we'll run the meeting today. Can I just check with colleagues that that's clear, if there's any questions from any of that? Is that okay? So that's in terms of the purpose of the meeting and also the way that we'll run it. So if we just move on to the first item on the agenda, obviously that's then about any absences. So unfortunately today, we do have a number of apologies. So we've got Junaid Bajwa, our non-executive director, isn't able to be here. Glenn Wells, our chief Partnerships Officer, and also John Taylor, our Interim Chief Financial Officer. So they send their apologies. So if you can record those in minutes, please, Natalie, that would be very helpful. If we just move on to page number 3 and look at the declarations of interest, we've got our register of interests. Can I first of all just double check if there are any additions to that? Paul, I think, did you have one you wanted to raise?
Yeah, Closed Loop Medicine put in a marketing authorization application.
Okay, so we can just make that amendment, please. That would be great. And Graham Cook, I think you had an additional declaration you wanted to make as well?
Yes, a couple of things. So I'm involved in a project which is between Imperial College Healthcare Partners and Pfizer, which is a commercial contract, which is underway. And I'm part of an application, a successful application for a flu platform trial in the UK, which is going to be REMAP CAP. And in looking at that, I realized I hadn't put down my day job, so we should add to the list my consultant roles at Imperial College NHS Trust and Chelsea and Westminster NHS Trust.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you for that, Natalie. If we can just add those to the register. I'm not aware of any other additional interests that anyone needs to declare. So obviously, I've looked at the agenda and against the different interests, and at this stage, I don't see there's any need to ask anybody to leave the room for any of the particular items. Can I just check that the board's content with that as an approach? So, obviously we do take our conflicts of interest very seriously, and on that basis, it's important to review that at each and every meeting. So thank you for that. If we can then just move on to page number 7 in the board pack, we've got the minutes of the previous meeting. Can first of all, I just check that they are an accurate record? Did anyone have any comments on the wording of the minutes? I'm seeing some shaking of the heads around the table. So on that basis, can we take the minutes as an accurate record and approved? Okay, Natalie, if we could therefore approve the minutes, please, that would be very helpful. And then on page number 13, we've got our list of actions from the board. So I just want to focus on the items that are due today. So they're largely highlighted in red. So action 29 and 51 are both on the agenda today, so we'll be able to complete both of those during this meeting. Items 64 and 84 have already been completed, and that's the note that I've got there. So I think there's nothing more to say on those, I don't believe. So and then on so action number 85, there is an action here for Mark Bailey as Chief Scientific Officer to follow up with Professor Lucy Chappell. Can you just give us an update on where you are with that?
There's now a meeting set up. I'll then report back when it's been held.
Great. Okay, thank you. Good to see that progress has been made on that. And then action number 86, Mandy, this is about the work programme for the Organisational Development and Remuneration Committee. Any progress there?
Yes, we're putting together the meeting agendas and for next year and arranging times to talk to the chief officers.
So that's also in hand, which is excellent. So we can mark that as in progress. And then action 87, John Taylor is unfortunately not here today, but I have checked with him in advance and he has confirmed that that written response has been sent. So I think we can close action number 87 as completed as well, Natalie, please. Okay, so they were the actions that were outstanding on the list. Can I just check if there are any other matters arising from the last meeting or any of these actions that anyone else wants to raise? Nope. Okay, excellent. So that allows us to move very swiftly on to the first substantive item on the agenda. So that's page number 16, and that's a report from our Chief Executive. So June, what are the most important activities and priorities from your point of view?
Well, thank you, Chair. And I think it's clear from the report, its detail and its comprehensiveness, that there's been a tremendously busy few weeks and a very productive few weeks. As we are here where the basic science and the research and innovation are done today, it's quite important to, I think, celebrate the impressive range of scientific research work, as well as leading the world on polio, the vaccine and the eradication of polio. There is work on TB vaccine discovery work there, vaccines made from other bacterial sources such as whooping cough, pertussis, and a new potency assay for influenza, the nanobodies which cross-react with viral hemagglutinin protein. So some really exciting and cutting-edge science there. But importantly also diagnostics work, and I think highlighting For example, the diagnostics work on cancer, minimal residual disease in leukemia being able to be measured, and work on the gut microbiome. So I think something really to, celebrate as we're here today, thinking of the impressive science that's done. Turning, of course, to our focus on healthcare access, which is a key deliverable, this month saw the approval of the first bivalent COVID vaccine that's against the COVID 4.5, BA.4.5 strain, and that's going to be an important additional vaccine. But we also saw approval of a new anti-epileptic, and clearly that is something to be sharing with the board. The cenobamate is an important step forward. It's not very often that we see a new medicine in this important therapeutic area. Breadth of work, though, a workshop to engage manufacturers of e-cigarettes, those that are considering applying for a medicinal license for smoking cessation purposes, to get companies aware of the high standards they'll need to meet, and then a controlled distribution for a medicine for myeloma, multiple myeloma, lenalidomide, so that when generics come through, there is real consistency in how patients are looked after there in terms of the special precautions and measures. Patient safety, of course, always our first priority, and a number of safety issues are covered in the report. I won't go into them in any detail, but we've just had Med Safety Week, encouraging with us 80 other countries to get more reports from healthcare professionals and patients investing in that joint endeavour to improve safety. We've recruited a chair for our interim devices working group. Chair, you had a key role there, and that again is an important step forward to provide advice not just on safety issues for devices, but also in the coming months to be thinking about the new legislative framework. In that regard, you'll want to note that there is now a 12-month extension for the new regulations, and also in relation to devices, a new reporting manufacturer's online tool going live. So a real sense of progress in relation to safe use of medical devices. Our partnerships group are driving forward regulatory reform, particularly having had big consultation responses on clinical trials as well as medical devices. And so we're looking forward to pushing that through to the next stage as soon as there's a readiness for that. And now we're turning to a very important aspect, our refreshed delivery plan. Great to see that out there, sharpening our focus on patient involvement, healthcare equity, innovative ways of working, and all to play for with the work on the corporate plan for the next 3 years, which we'll be looking into this afternoon. So it's a big overview, but by way of saying, I think, a real time of being productive. I'll stop there, Chair, and really glad to pick up questions.
Great. Well, thank you very much, June. As always, I continue to be impressed by the immense breadth of activities the agency is involved in. Just from a personal point of view, I've always, the best part of my job, if I'm honest, is actually been involved in some of the interviewing. And you mentioned that we've been interviewing for the Interim Medical Devices Group, but we also appointed Dr. Anna Maria Brady as the chair of the British Pharmacopoeia Commission. And I'm really, really delighted with Anna Maria. She was the deputy chair previously. We was an international field she was competing against, and I think that's a really, really strong appointment. In the same way that last year we were looking at, we appointed Sumunir Mohammed as the chair of the Commission on Human Medicine. So there's a real strength in depth, and when you have the opportunity to meet some of these clinicians and experts, it's really very humbling to understand how keen people are to work with us. And I find that really, really encouraging. So thank you, June, for that. Can I ask colleagues if there are any specific questions or points that anybody wanted to raise on June's report? Michael, can I come to you first? Can I just ask you to use the microphone?
Thank you. I do apologise. 2 questions. June, an excellent report as ever. Can I turn to paragraph 4.1 and 4.2? And this refers to the 12-month extension to the implementation of the future devices regulations. If you look when Baroness Cumberledge reported, and I don't know how many years post that 2024 will be, but is that not a delay? Should members of the public be worried by that?
Members of the public shouldn't be worried about that, because the measures we're putting in place on safety, some of which we'll talk about in due course today, are proceeding with a great deal of energy. the legislative framework also needs to be thought about with great care so that we get the right balance. Safety will come first, and as I say, the actual operationalising of higher standards of safety protection is underway as we speak. But very important that we get the right balance of what's on the face of the legislation and what can be put in guidance. And I'm pleased to say that work is now underway to start that preparatory thinking. So no member of the public needs to be concerned here. We're in the business of getting it right. And that means creating an environment where access is assured in a way that the incredibly vibrant industry can deliver for us.
Thank you.
Okay. That was your first question. You said you had a second one?
My second question really relates to global collaboration on compliance, which again, I think is excellent. I suppose my question is this. Where are the really biggest challenges that we face on ensuring greater collaboration with our peer regulators?
Well, thank you. I think one of the challenges, and I'm sure my colleagues in the Executive Committee would agree, is simply creating that space, momentum, prioritisation, so that we go into the international discussions with a very clear set of deliverables. Sorry that Glenn Wells isn't here today, he's not able to be here today, but I know our partnership group are really in this space to create suitable prioritisations of the fora that we occupy. I was at the Dublin meeting of the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities, and it's really encouraging, this was last week, for the very first time face to face, to see how there is a coalescence of thinking around some of the important issues. What we've learned from COVID on vigilance, what we're doing on innovation, and particularly on the manufacture and supply side, where compliance is so important. So the scene is set. We need to just have that prioritized set of deliverables where we go in knowing exactly where we want to, with colleagues, get results. But that's, I think, all to play for why we have a lead on the partnership side.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Hader, I think you had a question.
Thank you, Stephen. And June, thank you for the paper. Really, so much good stuff going on. One comment and one question. It was great to see the note on remote inspections. Really pleased to see the hybrid model kind of taking off. Should massively help us reduce our costs and increase our capacity, and I hope we can maintain quality. Question was on 2.6 on the roadmap for software and AI. I saw the publication, all the different work packages, and some really good breadth and depth of the work packages there. I was just interested in your thoughts around harmonization with the FDA and EMA's roadmaps, or really any other regulators. Has that been taken into account at this point in time? Will that come later? How important is that in your opinion?
It's extremely important, and the work that was done with the FDA and Health Canada on best practice has really set the agenda for where we go. The appointment of our expert to lead through the IMDRF discussions together with FDA really tells us we've got this golden opportunity. And I think I would just add to that, our access partnership, Australia, Canada, Singapore, Switzerland, is unearthing very common approaches, Switzerland particularly, in the way they plan to use artificial intelligence as an internal tool. So I think we're ideally placed. Again, we have the expertise, we have the map. Your point is about where we pick up those commonalities that we can work perhaps more efficiently by buddying with other regulators. And I don't know, Chair, if Laura Squire would like to say a word or two, or other colleagues, because I think to animate what I've just said as a set of principles.
I would just add the value of the IMDRF. We've become members of the IMDRF this time round, and we sent someone to Sydney for the meeting in September, who led a session on AI. And there are working groups there, which we're very much part of. So I think it's a very exciting area of global collaboration, and probably one of the areas in my team that I definitely don't worry about in terms of who we are talking to across the world, because it's a very, very active dialogue. So yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Mandy, did you have a question?
Yes, one is a follow-up from the work on inspections, and maybe in a future meeting, how could we get assurance of how we're sharing information, and that's contributing to patient safety, because it's medicines manufacture is very complex and global. So I think we've got good signs, but I think it would be good to report that back. And the other question was really about how we're progressing with our skills and recruitment to actually fulfill our role. We're doing lots of good work, but just a quick check really on how we're progressing with the recruiting of new positions.
Well, thank you. Two really important questions. I do think, Chair, it would be worth having a session around the role of inspectors, and particularly given having left the EU, are we actually in a good position now to be sharing information internationally? I'm glad to say, going back to the ICMHRA, the International Coalition meeting I was at, we're very active in a quality and inspection group, initially led by the FDA, around security of supply chains, but also how inspectorate information can be stored in the cloud so that at any one time on the quality of a medicine, there's immediate and rapid access to the latest data. And I think that is almost setting a global standard for how we share information. It should be there, it should be up to date, so that at any moment a member of the public is utterly confident that we know if an issue has arisen. So it's a big challenge, but I think ICMHRA is showing real determination here. So I hope that is of some reassurance, but I do think our inspection compliance strategy would be worth a further look. We'd greatly value the chance to have a seminar or similar board kick the tires session, because I think now is the time, building on the success during COVID when boots weren't going to be on the ground, to say how much better we can do. Isn't just a matter of efficiency, it's actually doing things better. The second question is close to the heart of all the executives here, as well as non-execs. ExCo is very much exercised to recruit the right skills for the right jobs. Our one agency leadership group isn't yet complete in some key areas, and admittedly there are some moves of staff for career reasons, or people who've stayed till the end of COVID who are naturally moving on to retirement, for example, that we have some key gaps. And I'd like to assure the board that we've now secured additional services over and above our HR team in the form of specific headhunters for key roles. It's absolutely essential, and for the public's confidence and public health, that we get the best in the field, and that means going looking. We've had some successes in our digital and technology area, but it's so important that we don't leave any stones unturned in getting the right people in. Would be glad to provide in another context perhaps some more specifics on that, but for today's purposes, I know that the support is there, and it's just a case of driving that recruitment as hard as we possibly can.
Good, thank you for that. Any other questions, colleagues? Mercy, you would normally ask us a question on patient safety at this moment.
And you didn't even warn me about that. So actually, I was going to talk a little bit about international cooperation, but I thought we kind of really covered that. I guess I haven't got anything specific on patient safety. Obviously, PSEC is keeping an eye on this, but I would encourage colleagues to think about the patient safety angle to bring to PSEC on a regular basis, because I think that would really help, where we could do some deep dives into some of the issues. So that's the only comment I would have on the paper. As usual, June, such a comprehensive and really worthwhile kind of look at what we're doing.
Yeah, and for members of the public, PSEC is the Patient Safety and Engagement Committee. And I think personally, I got a lot of reassurance, June, that there's regulatory action being taken, and you've listed out the examples in the report. And it's really important that we seen to demonstrate that we're taking action where we see issues, and that's very important.
To back that up, though, and through Mercy's leadership of the Patient Safety and Engagement Committee, there are some important papers coming through the 1-year anniversary of the publication of our patient involvement strategy. Where have we driven forward? What needs more thinking? And secondly, an important consideration of how we communicate risk better in the light of all the tools that we can use and the expertise. During COVID, we had support from the Winton Centre. There's a way forward if we can actually use experts in the field. So there's going to be some important work for your committee, not just cases where we've benefited from patient input, but how we actually do better, both on the inputs and the outputs side.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you for that. I really appreciate it. Just for the purpose of the minutes, can I suggest that the board does actually express its thanks and gratitude to the work of all agency staff, because it is a huge team effort, and this work does not happen easily or quickly. So thank you very much to everyone who's been involved in that. Then the action I think we did pick up there was around some sort of a report around inspections and compliance. Laura, that's obviously in your area. Just in terms of what would be the right time and the right frame for us to consider, do you think?
I think we are actually bringing a discussion on the compliance strategy, which brings all of this in to the executive committee. So I think once we've had that discussion, fairly soon after that would be very doable. Yeah. Great.
Okay, so let's add an action to review the agency's compliance strategy. That's probably the best way to frame it. In the new year, please, Natalie. We'll work out the schedule at a later date, but we'll figure out that. That's a very clear action. So thank you for that. Okay, that allows us to move on to the next item, which is a sort of a long item. Unfortunately, John Taylor's not here today to introduce the paper, but we've got page number 27 to 35. We've got a progress report on our MHRA delivery plan, and then from pages 36 to 48, we've got some detail on our operational performance in Q2. So, June, is there any just introductory comments that you'd like to make in terms of the way that the Executive Committee have reviewed the delivery plan to put this paper together?
Yes, it's a milestone for us that we've wished to create a composite that actually is much more useful for the board, that looks at delivery and performance in the round, because it does lend itself to that distillation that we can look to see where we've progressed, what's been done, but also how well the performance is working in key areas, and whether or not the board thinks that we should be looking particularly at redeployment or moving of resources. So it is the first time, and I know if John were able to be here, he'd be saying it is a work in progress. It's not the polished final product. So as well as looking at the specifics, it'd be really good, Chair, if the board discusses how well we're conveying these matters and areas to improve that. It's got to be at the heart of what the board does, and a really important tool. If we can create the right, not just presentation, but the right way of putting the issues together, then we'll have the richest discussion. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Why don't we consider this in 3 parts then? Why don't we just, first of all, take any questions around the progress on the delivery plan first? Then let's take some questions around the operational performance next. And then the third point that June just mentioned, does this type of combined report meet the board's needs? So I think if we do it in that sort of structured way, I think it'll just make the best use of the time. Just on the delivery plan itself, I've got to say, June, I was very struck by the amount of progress that has been made and the number of actions that have been completed. This was a 2-year program of work. This is effectively reflects the first 18 months of that 2 years, and it feels that we're pretty much on track. What's the one area that you're most concerned about, just from a chief executive's perspective, on the delivery of the delivery plan?
Well, before talking about that, I would just say that we're very rigorous about timelines, and if things slipped from September to October, we will have noted that. Clearly, sadly, there were various other events in September that inevitably meant that work wasn't proceeding at the pace that one might have expected. So that's by way of, if you like, a little bit of clarification. I think obviously we're going to be pressing hard on some of the areas that we've designated as red. And I think that we're at a pivotal point in looking at our, not transformation, now shift to delivery of services. Very grateful for the work and leadership from the organisation, Development and Remuneration Committee, keeping a focus and looking at the services as they come through. But we're pivoting, if you like, to use that word, from looking at how things work to actually what we're delivering. So that, if you like, is the top of my list, to ensure that we have enough resource and commonality of view that we are into delivery mode. We have got a new delivery director, and I know that there'll be a strong engagement with ODRC on that front.
Perfect. Okay. Colleagues, any specific questions around Mercy?
This is where I'm going to talk about patient involvement. So obviously the some of the patient things like patient reported outcome measures, patient champion network, and obviously getting a more diverse patient group and things, they're into the ambers and reds. I just want kind of reassurance that they're recoverable, and what's being done to mitigate this.
Alison, is that something that you would be able to pick up, just in terms of and some of the other measures around that patient involvement and engagement?
So we're really trying to bring patient engagement more into our
Yes, we're really trying to bring patient engagement more into our day-to-day work in benefit risk evaluation. And one of the things we're trying to do is to engage earlier in the benefit risk assessment process. So rather than look at the data and then engage with patients to get their views, we look to get that patient engagement in as early as possible. And I think I had a commitment that 50% of our benefit risk reviews would involve that early patient engagement. And one of the things we're looking to do, for example, in the teratogen review, is to really understand how people understand that risk perception. What does a teratogen mean to them? How do they understand the information on risk in the patient information leaflet, or those sort of risk measures? And if there is a pregnancy prevention plan in place, what do they understand by that? How is that information communicated? What additional risk minimization materials would be helpful? Would a video be helpful? Would graphics be helpful? That sort of thing. So that's a really key part of that teratogen review, which we're trying to launch. We did find, for example, those really in-depth patient engagements through the Yellow Card Biobank and the patient jurors was really helpful when we had an in-depth issue that had multiple facets that we wanted to explore in depth with patients. And we'd like to roll more of those sort of events out when we have conversations that we want to take a deeper dive on. It's really key, and this is a point about the Patient Consultative Forum, to get representation in those conversations. And that remains a challenge. And it's something that we're really aware of, really cognizant on, and it's a really high priority for us to seek that breadth of engagement.
Okay. So do you feel, and just to answer Mercy's question, do you feel that they're recoverable by the end of the delivery plan period, these objectives?
So they don't all sit specifically within patient safety and engaged patient safety. So I don't know if Rachel would like to comment on the red item on the Patient Consultative Forum.
Yeah, Rachel.
Yes, certainly, thank you. And just in answer to your question, Mercy, I think they are recoverable by the end of the year. There have been some delays because of delays in recruitment and staff shortages, but we are on track. We've got the team fully staffed now, and so I do believe we can recover by the end of the year. And just to highlight one of them, the second one, which is around an internal patient champions network and patient training, that's now been launched at the beginning of Q3. So it slightly missed the Q2 target, but it is very much up and running, and we've already got 20 members of staff signed up for that Patient Champions Network.
Great. Okay, thank you, Mercy. Any other thoughts around the delivery plan? Mandy?
Yes, it's really looking at the ambers, which for Q2, and whether they're going to turn red into Q3. So how we're addressing the ambers, just keeping our heads up on those things.
Yeah. I'd probably specifically point us towards the people strategy and the talent management model, engaging with our staff on the vision. You know, they're all amber at the moment, and they feel that they're vitally important to bring back on track. So, June, I don't know whether you've got a view on that, or whether we can again bring Rachel in.
Definitely, and the focus, and that's what comes from this, you know, the presentation is very much on we've got a delivery and performance committee that's now going to be under new leadership, and to keep that, what do we call it, the ambers from turning red. These issues, some of them look more delayed than having missed the end of September into October, would actually explain why there's an apparent slippage. The talent management is now actually extremely active, and we've got a new strategic leadership pushing that forward. It's central to making the great, you know, career destination and that we know the agency to be. So very much in mind.
Okay, and Rachel, just thinking about some of the engagement activities, that's vitally important as we're rebuilding the new agency. You know, your confidence in being able to ensure the ambers around engagement are going to not turn red?
Yeah, absolutely. Slight delay, but I think we will see those going back to green.
Perfect. Okay. Another one, if I may, actually, Mandy, just following your theme, just on ambers, is just around the regulatory management system, in particular. You know, because obviously that's one of the key significant investments. And Claire, I just wondered if you want to comment. You know, that's currently rated as an amber as well. You know, your confidence in being able to bring that in on track for the end of this period.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is it's a top priority for my team. And lots of people in digital and technology are working on that, so user researchers, engineers, and so on. But there is, and not to use too much digital and technology terminology, we are delivering in an agile way, and delivering an MVP, a minimum viable product. So minimum and viable being the operative words there, so something that our users, our staff can use. And that will be June next year, but that's not the only chance to deliver that. We'll continue to build upon it, functionality and changes to policy and regulation and so on, and we'll forever have a core product team, so that will always work on that. So I am confident, just because of the change in our delivery approach and the fact that it's a top priority definitely for my team and the agency, and we never take our foot off the gas. So that phrase will resonate with my teams, but that's the way it is and has to be. Yeah,
that's really good to hear. And Laura, just from your point of view, as you're obviously the senior responsible officer for the regulatory management system, your staff use this. Are you confident that there's been enough engagement with your staff in the development of this new system?
There's been a lot of engagement with my staff, and I mean, in some ways I see amber as saying requiring a lot of attention, and that's because it's difficult, but it's getting a lot of attention. I think there are challenges we're going to talk about performance, and exactly the same people are working on, you know, granting licenses for established medicines, as we also need to feed into this. So that is a constant challenge of balancing that. But at the moment we are doing that, and I think everybody sees the potential and the benefits of investing time now for the future. So Claire and I are working in very close partnership on this, and I'm comfortable.
Well, certainly from a non-executive perspective, I find that very reassuring. So thank you for both on that point. You know, and I think this is actually what the agency does need to do. You know, we do need to manage the day-to-day regulatory activities day in, day out, but we also need to be planning for the future and investing for the future. And that's a really classic example of exactly what we're doing. So I'm really pleased to see that. I suppose the other aspect around the delivery plan is that this will come to an end in March, and we've already started the development of a new 3-year corporate plan. And that actually is another opportunity for engagement with staff. So, Rachel, I was wondering if I could maybe just bring you in again just to explain what's happening with engagement on the new corporate plan as well.
Yeah, certainly, Chair. So we're planning a period of engagement over the next 4 months with both staff and external stakeholders. Now that the main themes from the corporate plan are, you know, starting to come together. So that work will start to happen after the next few days, starting before Christmas and building through January and February. And just to say, there has already been, as you would expect, extensive engagement with staff and leaders within the agency. It's now changing the focus to look outside as well.
Yeah, I think that's going to be very, very important. So, okay, so unless there are any other comments, can I suggest that we note the report on the delivery plan part with our thanks, you know, I think to use Claire's analogy there, you know, really keep the pressure on and actually sort of keep these things moving, because there's some really important topics in here. But I think I'm pleased with the overall progress, I've got to say. So thank you for that. If we then just look at pages 36 to 48, we've got a detail around the operational performance. And again, maybe just to sort of make it easier to navigate, can I suggest we just do a page turn? And if there are any specific questions on each of the pages, rather than going backwards and forwards, I just think that might be easier, if that's okay with the board. So the first one, the first set of slide is there on patients, public partners and customers. Again, I think we can see there's a widespread of communications that are ongoing, lots of media mentions. Any questions on those particular metrics? Rachel, are you confident and happy with the performance of this in Q2?
Yes, overall, I mean, I think when you look at the indicators, there are some areas that we're giving attention to. So, for example, our overall response time for customer inquiries has gone up from about 4 days to 6 days on average. We're looking at how we bring that slightly back down. It's still very much within the cross-government service standards for responses, but we'd like to get that back down. But it is against the backdrop of overall a higher number of inquiries that we're seeing at the moment. So we find these stats very helpful in terms of just sort of calibrating performance month on month.
Yeah, but I'll be honest, when you see the data presented like this and realise we get 5,500 inquiries per month, I think that sort of starts to give an element of the scale of the operation in terms of answering questions here. So we want to engage with the public, but there is a really significant resource involved in doing this. So I think that's helpful to just flag that up. Okay, if there's no other questions on that, then if we move on to science, research and innovation, again, we've got some initial metrics have been presented here. Can I just check if there are any specific questions on the operational performance for science, research and innovation? Mark, again, just the same question to you. Yeah, how pleased are you with the performance of these particular metrics, and what would you like to see next?
I'd like to see more on the trends. A couple of these metrics don't really show how it compares in previous years. Overall, I am very pleased. We're particularly doing well on the batch release. We've got some performance beginning to appear around clinical trials, which we're addressing just to get our turnaround times up. But overall, very good, and very much keen to improve some of the narrative on this so that the board can also understand a little more what this means. Yeah,
I think the interpretation is really important, Mark, to be fair, but I think you're well aware of that for the future. But again, I think it's starting to show the breadth, and I've seen some of this data is actually, I think, genuinely really helpful. Seeing the number of clinical trials that we've approved here in the UK, it's best part of 200. So that's quite significant in a quarter. So there's a lot of activity going on. Okay, so moving on then, if that's okay, to healthcare quality and access. Again, just ask if there are any specific questions around that. Again, Laura, I know this is something that you've been working on extensively with your team. I think we've got some good measures and metrics here. What's the one area that you'd like to focus on most, do you think, of all your areas? Because you've got such a huge breadth.
Yes, I have, and I was having a discussion with Paul earlier. It's one of the things. I mean, we've actually lost in here for some reason, so we're not quite there on this. The actual number of established medicines licenses that we granted last quarter, and that was 222. And of those, 3 were first off exclusivity period generic. So a very small number were in that area, and really understanding what is coming through that is best value for the NHS is work that I'm doing now with a sponsor team and also with the NHS to understand that. But I think one of the measures I'd really like to get for the future of the board is kind of cost to serve, because I have two equal sized teams broadly, innovative medicines and population health, and population health are essentially looking at established medicines, and that's your 222. Innovative medicines are looking at new active substances, and that's your 30. So if you're saying to me, why is it still taking all this time? The volumes are very different. So the cost to serve is going to be very different. We don't know what it is yet. We're doing work with John and the finance team to get some really good nailed down time recording. But I think being able to demonstrate that would be very, very helpful. And then the second point is really understanding the priorities and how we prioritize, particularly in established medicines, to make sure that the ones with the biggest public health implications are getting through. We do that, but doing that in a more intentional and structured, systemized way, I think, is something I really want to look at.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Certainly I think being risk proportionate is really important here, and that maybe give you some opportunities for efficiency improvement. But again, as you and I have both been in meetings with trade associations, and the clear message there has been we want predictability.
Yes.
So I think actually, particularly in your area, and I think it's quite nice showing you the range bars that you've got on some of the data there. If we can bring the range down as well, now that needs collaboration with industry. It's not all in our gift. If the quality of the applications and submissions are not good enough, that is going to cause delay. If companies do not respond quickly enough to requests for further information, that will cause delay. So this is not all in our gift. But I think as a principle, to try and bring down the range of time it takes to get approvals, I think will be a really nice measure for us to be able to look at.
And just to end on a high, it also needs people. And I think I mentioned last time that we'd appointed 8 new people who are now coming through the door and starting to be trained. We've just had another successful competition where we've identified 6 additional ones. Brilliant. So we're starting to fill the holes in there. And then because we have had underspends at the beginning of the year, we're bringing in a further 3 experience for a fixed term to help really boost the resource in that area. So it does feel like, with the regulatory management system as well, and the collaboration that's building with industry, I really feel we are turning a corner, and would like to continue seeing that happening.
Yeah, and that's why the transparency of our performance is so important. But thank you for all that you and your team are doing, Laura. That's excellent. Okay, I'm not seeing any other specific questions. So, oh, sorry, Mandy.
Not really a question, but I just think this area has come forward really considerably in the last couple of years. We've been asking for this data for a long time, and I now feel we're getting a handle on this, and I think it's really, really important for the work on delivery of the transformation. So I would just express our congratulations to the team, really.
Thank you for that. And Raj?
Yeah, I wanted to echo the same thing as well. Congratulations to the team. It's really nice to see how tangible the progress is, even just in the last few months. One area where I'm just trying to get some insight is the predictability, the need for predictability, and the volume that you're talking about, Laura, in population health. Is there any way you can get insight into what's coming downstream from industry that feeds into your established medicines? There'll be a number of variations, there'll be a number of renewals, the kind of activities. Have you got any tools or insight that helps you with that? Because to your question then, Stephen, you can prioritize depending on the medical need of the product, 1. And 2, you can prioritize in terms of workload once you know what the pipeline is. And I just wonder if there were any tools that could help Laura and her team on that front.
Laura?
So I think in terms of what is coming out of data exclusivity period, we can absolutely see that coming down the track. And we do see that coming down the track, and that gets prioritized. But really, for affordable medicines in the NHS, it's not just that. It's having a healthy competition between medicines, which creates that economic benefit that they need. So we don't just need to do those. So I think there are, I'm seeing it in 2 sort of dimensions. There are ongoing conversations with industry and asking them to come to us earlier and understand what's coming down the track is absolutely part of it. Also, I think on the DHSC NHS side, it's also understanding where they see potential future needs, supply risks, those sorts of things. So we're having both of those conversations at the moment to try and get a picture in the middle that really helps us to prioritise in a more constructive way.
Yeah. Okay, that's excellent. Thank you for that. Okay, if we moved on to safety and surveillance, can I just quickly check if there are any specific questions before I ask Alison to comment? No? Alison, again, we've got some really good data in here. Again, what is the area that you're most concerned about when it comes to safety and surveillance?
Well, it's not a concern. It's actually how do we best present the information so that people can understand the work that's going on in the
Oh,
sorry, I beg your pardon. Not a concern. Really trying to work out how best to present this information. So what we've tried to do with the yellow card reports is to illustrate the different types of reporters. But for that particular section, trends are difficult to report because they're heavily influenced by the COVID-19 vaccine reports, and it depends where we are in a deployment. So that's why we've pulled those out, so that then we can start to present trends with and without that, because they skew the figures too much. In terms of the benefit risk evaluations, they're hard to report on because the range of the different types of benefit risk reviews are huge. You can have incredibly complex multi-stakeholder reviews that take months and months to go through, more studies done, more information required. And then you can have relatively quick reviews. It might be a field safety notice from a device that can be relatively quick to review. So how we present that to the board so that they understand the scale and scope of the work is something that we're trying to improve on. And I think we're getting there, but we probably could try and break those down a little bit more.
Yeah, you see, I think that's really moved forward, if I'm honest, because I think actually benefit risk evaluation is complex and it's hugely different. And I completely get that. But because we've had no scale of the numbers, we also had no appreciation of that level of complexity. And I think this starts to tease that out. Similarly, with the actions, the specific actions that we're taking to minimize risk to patients, I feel that's a really helpful, because it's not just about all the inputs, it's what are we doing with it?
Yes.
And of course that's going to vary enormously, but I think it gives a level of scale of impact in the communities and the population that we're serving. And so I think this is moving exactly in the right direction, Alison.
Good to know,
because
that's helpful.
Because it's what are we doing with all that information, all that expertise and all that information. So that's how I think about it. Okay, Raj, you had a question.
Totally concur. I think it's absolutely moving in the right direction, even from 6 months ago, when we were looking at the status. So kudos, Alison, to you and your team in terms of what we're getting. One area that we had discussed in the past, and we shelved it a little bit just because of priorities, there were so many things happening on the safety front, is really how do we get our patients have a better understanding of how benefit risk works. Do you recall at the early part of the year, we said this is something we should look into to see. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is to see, is there any insight on that? Is that something we need to bring back to the radar to work? Because I think if the public, particularly patients, our engagement with patients is really moved as well as, similar trajectory as we see here. But if we perhaps then now tackle maybe next year, put it on, how do we get patients to actually understand? I would say the very thorough work the agency does on how you measure benefit risk, the ratio, what's in, that can help, I think, the public and patients to also give confidence that the process and procedures you have in place, right, is sound. So just a thought there.
It's a very complex area because even though we're illustrating actions, that actually is not impact. So it's not impact on the patient themselves. And I think that's what you're trying to get at. And one of the things that we could do to better understand, when we have a regulatory action, which might be advice to use an alternative therapy, how is that taken up? And how can we assess that maybe through CPRD, tracking prescriptions. But even then, if somebody's moved on to an alternative therapy, how do we understand what their health outcome was from that? So it's a very complex area, but one I personally would love to explore, because that's the key thing that we need to assess.
And obviously that's out, it's out of our gift in the sense it's, that's the implementation in the NHS, but able to identify, yes, this is being implemented, or no, it's not. Then what other actions do we need to take to help the NHS to, to deliver the safety impact that we're looking for? So I think this is an area that will evolve, but I think there's a step forward here, Alison. So thank you for what you've done so far. Appreciate that. Okay, just looking at people, I'm just conscious of time, but we know that we've been through a major period of change. So not surprisingly, the turnover of staff went up. It now feels like it's coming down. There's still a churn, but it's coming back towards the civil service average is the way that I'm sort of reviewing that. But again, I think we understand that conceptually, but stabilizing the organization is critical, let's be honest. So and I know that chief officers are working very hard to fill up posts and actually achieve that level of stability. So please carry on with that. And then on the money, Michael, I think you've had an audit and risk assurance committee. Is there anything actually that came out of that would is worth mentioning on the financial slides?
Yeah, Stephen, there are 2 points I would make. They're not really assurance questions, but they're observations. So the first is, and I would echo what Mandy and colleagues have said, I think this has moved forward tremendously and well done. I am conscious, though, given the pressures on public finances, there's nothing in here that enables us to demonstrate our value for money. Do we, as a regulator, deliver value for money? And that's really having trend analysis around unit costs, comparing those costs with other regulators. And I think that's the next stage in the iteration of this. Often very difficult to do, but very important. The other point I'd say that came out of ARAC, and it's inevitable, all organisations face this, the degree of optimism bias, but also if you are not filling your headcount projections for key skills, the natural thing you do is buy in skills. That may be more expensive. So there is a risk within this that we are substituting with outsourced staff at higher cost. And I actually would recommend to the executive that we need to monitor that very carefully. I understand why we have to do it. We've got commitments in terms of service delivery. But I am conscious of the situation that we got ourselves in, particularly in digital, before Claire's time, where we were unduly reliant on consultants to deliver, and they had the intellectual capital, and it increased the risk to the agency. I know we're not in that space, but we need to remain alert to it. But I think the projection, the direction of travel with this report is very good.
Good. Okay. I think it's an interesting point, June, around value for money.
And I'd like to reassure colleagues, executives working hard for the coming business round. We're just in time to start putting in place collection of unit costs. May not be perfect, but that's the way we need to deliver the plan for the next year.
Okay. Right. Maybe, Catherine, could I just bring you in from a Department of Health point of view as our Department of Health sponsor? Any observations on the overall performance of our delivery plan and our operational performance to date that either gives you concern or congratulations? Hint.
Noted. No, I've no specific comments. It's just really good to see the reporting taking shape in the way it is. It's much easier to assess what's happening and to read it, and I know that's taken an awful lot of work, so thank you. And it's really good to see performance moving in the direction it is. Well done.
Good. Okay, Claire.
Just a quick one from me in case anyone's interested or wonders. A couple of my sections made it in and then out again around in the operational performance section. So cyber and IT support issues and so on. So cyber, I don't want to give away trade secrets, but we are on average performing above average compared to other comparable organisations, but there's always so much more to do. So all of that's happening in the background, and we have the appropriate reports and so on, but I didn't feel they were appropriate for this particular report. And again, IT support issues, she says, as she grows inwardly, is one of the 17 things that keep me awake at night. And a lot of work being done in the background there, not just because it needs to, and we have the reporting on how often a system's down and how long it takes to do something, but just listening to colleagues here, Laura, for example, how long it takes to process applications, the technology is fundamental in that, and even costs to do things, the IT interweaved into all of that. So I wanted to provide that assurance that those things are being looked at also as a priority. We have many, but caveated with, I suppose, an injection of reality, as in MHRA was merged from a couple of other organisations. So if you imagine all the different technology, process, people, tools and legacy, and what we need to do around automation and self-service, all of that is happening in the background, but debate about whether or not reporting should be in this form.
Yeah, you see, I think I'd expect also, I think we do need something on digital in the future, in future reports, and also on partnerships as well. So I think we need the complete picture. But so that I think that's been helpful just to have gone through that quite specifically. June did ask a question at the beginning in terms of does this report broadly meet the board's needs in terms of sort of format and approach? It was a conscious decision to actually look at our short-term and our long-term and short-term performance in one single report, which I know was a bit of a challenge for the executives putting this together, but I felt that we need to do both. So let's look at our performance both at the same time. Is that a helpful approach, or does the board prefer to see something else? Mercy?
I think it's shaping up and it is clearer. I think for some areas, maybe more the trend stuff, as Mark was saying, that would be really useful. So we see that progression and if there are any stumbling blocks to it. Yeah,
trends and I think interpretation. I think we need to keep working on the narrative, because it's what do we take from this? What does this data mean? I think is really important, but I think it's definitely moved forward. Any other thoughts about the format or the broad content? Raj?
I think interpretation from two aspects. One, context of what it looks like now, but also, if possible, a little bit of forecasting to say what is that context moving forward, because there'll be other factors that might change. So we can look at both and adjust and gives it a bit more weighting if you're looking at the long term.
Yeah, because the demand on our services is not equal. Yeah. So there are sort of peaks and troughs all the time. So being able to anticipate, well, we would anticipate that by the end of the year to still level out, or whatever the answer is. Okay. So I'm sensing, despite not many comments, that actually there's broad support for the approach. So June, I think, thank you to you and the team for pulling this together. I think it's helpful to see short-term and long-term performance in that same report. So let's continue with that approach and then look to have the next version even better.
Super.
Okay. That being the case, then, I'd like to move on to the next item, and I think that's where we can actually bring a guest in online as well. So if Pooja can be promoted onto the screen, that would be very helpful. So the next item is about how is the MHRA providing safe access to data for research? And Alison, this is something in your area. Pooja, good morning. I hope you can see me. Would you just like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Stephen. I'm Pooja Miles. I'm Director of CPRD.
Thank you for joining us this morning, Pooja. I really appreciate it, and for helping to author the paper. But Alison, are there any introductory comments that you'd like to make?
No, I think this is just a very pertinent time to bring this to the board. There's obviously growing public awareness of data privacy and calls for greater transparency also around data sharing. But obviously the key priority there is assurances that healthcare data is safe and secure and is only used for intended purposes. I suppose what I would like to emphasize, and Pooja will bring out, is this is a strengthening or an already very robust process through CPRD around how they ensure the data they use is safe, secure, and only used in intended purposes. And they've been following the 5 SAFE frameworks for many years, which has recently been validated by an external NHS audit. But we can always do better, and now there is more technology with IT advances to enable us to move into what is called a trusted research environment. And I think Pooja is best placed to pick up some of the technical discussion around that. But yes, I think it's an excellent move forward and really aiming to strike the balance between access, but safety and ensuring privacy.
That's great. So again, I think the paper's really well written. So thank you for that, Pooja. I think also we can assume that the paper's been read. But is there any particular points you'd like to draw out for the board's attention, Pooja, before we go to questions?
Just to say that when people look at, because there's a lot of national discussions around development of trusted research environments, people always assume, oh, this is all about technology and building the technology infrastructure. And if it was only that, we're well on our way towards that, and we've made quite a lot of progress. But actually, it's more than that. It's about the policies and processes underpinning this new mode of data access, and it's also about stakeholder engagement.
Yeah.
And a whole lot of stakeholders, whether it be the research clients, patients, NHS digital, NHS organizations, or data custodians. So it is quite a major piece of work. It is going to be quite a major transition for CPRD.
Yeah, that's great. Well, again, thank you for that. So, colleagues, can I ask if there are any immediate questions to this? Paul, this is an area of real interest for you. So do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I mean, first a minor point of clarification in terms of when the delivery plan is going to be complete. Because I think the earlier paper said end of 25-26 and your paper said 23-24. And then a particular question, 4.3.1, which talks about several different groups who are involved in TRE creation and the health data scene, and how those groups are interacting and dividing their work, and sort of reassurance that it is coordinated.
Okay, Pooja, could you help us with that? Those two questions?
Yeah, so the first thing is, so for us, we are aiming to deliver, to move almost completely, and we say almost completely because there will invariably be exceptions, but predominantly to a TRE-based model of data access by the end of 24-25. So that is the timeline we are working to. We've already started development, and development is pretty much like Claire said before, with technology developments nowadays, you follow this agile methodology, which is quite sensible because you develop things in phases. We've developed phase 1, which is already being piloted. It's got some basic sample data sets, some basic tooling. We've used the Microsoft Azure TRE base on which we are building. Our next main milestone is end of 22-23, where we should have what we are calling our minimum viable product 2, and that will host one of our main primary care databases, CPRD Aurum, and it'll also include an OMOP version, which is a common data model version of CPRD Aurum, and things like software packages like Ars Data, Python, etc., which we will then pilot with some of our existing clients. And then we're going to do the add-ons, because we have moved on a lot in research, and people are doing things like machine learning, etc., where it's not a simple matter of we have to keep evolving and making sure if we're going to switch off access to data in other formats, giving out data, we need to be able to give them all the tools they need. So that is our model, that is our plan. By the end of 24-25, predominantly a TRE-based model of data access. So that's the first bit. The second bit is, yes, working with all the different groups can sometimes be challenging, but for us, it has been present on all the groups. And luckily for us is all the groups that I've listed in the paper, they're quite aware that this is a big national initiative. This is about, this is the UK actually working together to get to this new place where we can provide more secure data access and give that assurance to patients. So everyone is very aligned. So far, it's really good to see that there are no conflicting messages. There are some knotty problems that all of us acknowledge, and we're all working together. So I have not noted any concerns in that area so far.
Okay, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, the Goldacre report actually sort of recommended potentially only one TRE, but maybe 2, maximum 3 in the whole country, and it did sort of highlight some sort of territorial issues between various groups. And there's it sort of seems that we are now one of the TREs, which is great, and there's sort of enormous opportunity, I think, not just for research but also safety, which would be really good to talk about with CPRD. And so it was, have those things been resolved since the Goldacre report?
Yeah, and this is where it's been quite sensible. So the task group that is working on the Goldacre review recommendations, they've been quite sensible about this. So there are some national TREs, and again, they've recognized that, there might have to be more than one national TRE, which is especially with the devolved nations. And we are working very closely with NHS Digital, because CPRD not just has primary care data, which we are data custodians for, we have a huge number of linked data sources which are coming from NHS Digital. So we have to work closely. We can't afford to be in a situation where they have their TRE, we have our TRE, and we refuse to talk to each other. So that is another key part of these negotiations. And so, for example, and they're using Amazon, so AWS for their TRE, we're using Azure. So we are having all these discussions like, okay, what are the common factors? How do we ensure that we can have these APIs and these secure linkages in place? So we are going to be part of that national TRE structure. There are also going to be a lot of sub-national TREs, which are standalone, just separate. So those things are being resolved, but there are very sensible people on the board. So far, I have no concerns.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you very much, Pooja. Graham Cook, I think you had a question online. Let's see if the technology works. Graham, we can see you. Do you want to ask your question?
Can you hear me okay?
We can indeed.
Great. I thought the paper was great. It's very positive, and I think it's really good to see MHRA being out in front with the move to TREs. I think the paper sets out the case for that very clearly. I guess what I wanted to hear a bit more about was what you saw the risks were, particularly in the transition. I think it's implied a little bit in what you've said, but I wonder if you could just sort of unpack it a bit as to what you see the biggest risks. And I'm wondering in particular about keeping engagement with clients and what it requires for them to move with you to a TRE, and what you can do to reduce any impact.
Okay, thank you, Graham. If you could maybe just switch your camera back off again, that would be helpful so we can see Pooja at this end. Thank you. Have we still got Pooja? Yeah, we have. Yes, there you go.
That is a very valid concern, and that was our biggest concern. To just give you some background, when I joined CPRD in 2017, we were talking about, we weren't using the terminology TRE then, we were looking at secure data access platforms. And we were having these conversations then, and we had a whole lot of discovery work, stakeholder engagement, and at that point, the technology hadn't advanced well enough for us to be able to fulfill all our clients' needs. And that is why it's taken so long. And even now, there are questions. So even in the Goldacre review, he did ultimately, he said that, yes, we must move to a TRE-based model of data access, but we're not going to talk about TREs for AI applications, because that was almost like too difficult. Because what we want is a situation where we want safe data access, but we don't want to stifle innovation either. And that is one of the big things with moving to a TRE-based model of data access is we as the data custodians are taking more responsibility for having all the tools that people might need. So I don't want to be in a situation where someone comes, oh, I want to do this research and the data is appropriate for them and it could have huge public health benefit. And I say, sorry, but because you can't take it out of our system and we can't provide you the tools, that's it. So that is why we are going slow. It's more than the technology itself. We also have to sort of think of, okay, there might be rare situations where we do have to allow data extracts because the tools are not there, but how do we then deal with that issue? And this is something which is being discussed nationally as well. What will be the criteria for those exceptions? There are other interesting questions which we don't have a sensible answer to right now, and this comes more in the policies processes bit, which is the idea that researchers have been asking us, can I bring my own algorithm? Can I bring my own data? Because I'm using data from other sources and I want to sort of federate them together in a federated analysis. So how do we do that sensibly without compromising the safety of our data? So those are some of the risks that I see. We're aware of the risk. We don't quite have all the answers right now, which is why the TRE processes and policies group has been set up, but it's not just something that we don't have the answer to. So this is a national issue and we're all discussing how to get there.
Okay, Graham, can I just maybe ask you just to come back in and say, does that answer your question? But also, is there any risks that you'd identified that have not been mentioned?
I mean, I think there's potentially a range which go from data security through to keeping clients engaged with your TRE to the opportunity cost. You said it's going to be a lot of work. And I think next time, if it comes back to board, it'll just be helpful to see you kind of share some of that thinking in a bit more detail about where the risks are and what you're doing about it. It sounds like you've thought about a lot of it and you're addressing it. I think it just wasn't quite clear from the paper.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you, Graham. I appreciate that one. Haider, I think you had a question next.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Pooja. Really, really good paper and lovely to see. I had a couple of questions. The first was actually on the timeline, similar to Paul's. I just wanted to touch on that again. So it'll be predominantly delivered in a TRE format by the end of 24-25, which is about 2.5 years away. We talked about some of the risks that are impeding progress. I was just wondering if you could highlight any other barriers or any levers we have to accelerate that, if there are. So that's question number one.
Should we just do them one at a time?
Yeah,
Haider,
sure.
is that okay? So how, just conscious of time, Pooja, but how could we accelerate the program? I think is Haider's question.
So from a technology perspective and from internal policies and processes perspective, we've put all the resource we could. So we're fine with that. One of the things that I am worried about is the linked data, because for the linked data, we have to work with external data partners. Now, what helps is, because we can, I mean, it might seem like not very helpful in the first instance, but it is actually a helpful lever. It's the Goldacre review, when it was published, they said in 3 years, he said we should be aiming to get to this TRE-based model of data access. So everyone nationally signed up to that. Everyone knows that they have to get to that point. And so far, we're all going to that point. We might have not all data sources which are actually on the TRE. So there might be some lagging, but for the primary care data, I'm confident that we will be able to get there by 24-25 end.
Okay, and your second question, Haider?
Really a general kind of question, Pooja. I'd love your thoughts around both how to improve data quality or ongoing work around data quality as we move to a TRE, and also scope and coverage. Are we planning to increase all of that as we move to a TRE?
Now, data quality and coverage are important factors for us, even irrespective of TRE. And data quality is something we've invested quite a lot of time and resource into. For example, every day when the data comes to us, we've got daily updates of the data. Our health data science teams are automatically running over 1,000 data checks. And we've worked with the FDA on the Sentinel Common Data Model, and with the OMOP Common Data Model, they have their own sets of tests. So that data quality test, they will continue. So from our end, we're doing what we can on data quality. We are very conscious that once you get to a TRE-based model of data access, people won't be able to see or manipulate the data as easily themselves. So there's greater responsibility on us to provide that assurance. So we've always, when we've done the data quality checks, we include data quality markers in the data, but we've also always aimed to publish data profiles talking about data quality. We've got lots of data quality publications that people can reference so that, they know and they have that assurance that will continue. There is a separate aspect to data quality, which is the stuff which we can do, but there are things which can be done at the data entry point. And actually, Alison might want to talk about this later, but we have this opportunity of actually teaching final year medical students, and that just before they graduate, about various patient safety aspects, but also we're going to talk about data quality. So that is another way, we can just encourage people. And so I was just doing those slides in the morning. Why is this important? Why is it important that, because we don't get your coded data. So if you put a code asthma, and in your free text notes, you've written ? Provisional diagnosis, but the researcher is inferring that it is asthma, that is a problem. So, telling those narratives and explaining to, the young doctors why it's so important to get those right. Another example is when we started onboarding the data, because sometimes people get frustrated with us. They say, why does it take you so much time? Look at Open Safely. They went and they just at a snap of a finger and they had the data. It's because of the data quality checks. So for instance, when we started onboarding one of the new database sources, we looked at when we compared the death recording in that data source to national data source, like the death registration data, there seemed to be a lot of missing deaths. And one of those things was because in the early years and before 2013, some of the practices, they thought, well, we don't want to clutter our systems. We're just going to purge all these patients who have died. So all these issues, we have to look into, and that remains relevant for us irrespective of TRE. So that was the data quality question.
Data quality is great. It's really important. So, Pooja, we could carry on for hours, but we don't have the time, unfortunately. So can I maybe just come back to Alison just to maybe sort of any final comment you'd like to make before we need to move on?
No, I mean, I think this is a critical step forward, but as Pooja says, one of the challenges is the interoperability and the data linkages.
Exactly.
And we're working hard to ensure that we don't lose any of the advantages, but actually just enhance and improve them. But yeah, no, I mean, we're excited about it, and it's a really key priority for us in the CPRD.
Great. Okay, well, the board is asked to note this report, but also to endorse the strategy of using a predominantly TRE, Trusted Research Environment-based access model for healthcare data. I'm assuming by the nods around the table that we're all very happy to endorse that. So again, if we can just reflect our thanks to Pooja and Alison and the team for their work, but also just to note the board's endorsement of this strategy. So thank you very much for your time, Pooja. I'm glad the technology's worked for us here as well. So thank you for your time today. And that means we can then move on to the next item on the agenda, which of course is what are the priorities for the MHRA science strategy to enable scientific innovation in the UK? And Mark, you can assume we've read the paper. It starts on page number 55, but any introductory comments you'd like to make?
Yes, thank you, Stephen. So this is a vital part for the agency. We are a science-driven organisation. Science is our lifeblood, and it certainly also is a big motivator of staff. The science we do is particularly focused on patient benefit, public health, and better regulation, and it should remain that way. But within it, there's lots of different things to do and a lot of hard choices on what science should be done. So this paper represents the latest stage of a process driven by the staff, and I'd particularly like to thank the ones who have participated in workshops and in early prioritisation mechanisms to try and work it out. In brief, we've gone from looking at a list of scientific disciplines, which we do, to starting to look at how impact is actually measured and how impact is basically brought into it, and that's the model we have. So we're very interested to understand the board's thoughts on prioritisation and how to then move it on to the next stage of a final strategy. Thank you.
Great. Oh, thank you, Mark. So, colleagues, I'm just wondering who'd like to start this. June, I know this is a topic that's very dear to your heart. Is there any particular thoughts as Chief Executive that you'd like to mention on the priorities for the science strategy?
Well, as Mark has said, this is a very good next step from the really helpful seminar we had here previously, but we're not in final form yet. And simply to encourage colleagues to be a bit aspirational about this, we've already said today, that the science that's undertaken in the teams here is world leading. So let's not just sit on a coattails or follow on or whatever. Let's see this as a really jewel in the crown of the UK. And as I say, ambition. Thank you.
Ambition. Okay. Paul, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of think about sort of science strategy is there are going to be things that only the MHRA can do, sort of special things that maybe sort of quite narrow and deep. But then there are also broader enabling things that we can do that will then facilitate other people's research. And sort of CPRD would be one of them, and how we can really build on that. I think there was one area that's perhaps missing. It's around the sort of social science, behavioural science. The questions which PSEC, I think, asks a lot. Now, how do patients perceive things? How do they actually use medicines in practice? Different ways of presenting things. That's the difference between efficacy, so how something performs in a trial, and effectiveness, how things perform in real life. That's a big opportunity for us.
Okay. Mark, any immediate reactions to the behavioural sciences?
It does appear on 2.3.10, but Paul is absolutely right. It's a growing area. We hear it from actually multiple different directions. It appears quite a bit in medical devices and how their usability as well.
Yeah.
So it is something that we have to weave in order to make it. And it's something I know we use a lot of external expertise to try and understand as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask actually, is that something that's an expertise that we need to develop internally, or is that something that we rely on our partners more?
That's one of the key questions within it, because across the board we partner on the science. We have certain in-house experts, some of them are world leading, but we also partner extensively at multiple levels. I'd say probably at the moment, this is an area which is perhaps more biased towards the partner side than the in-house side. And it's one of the questions on the prioritization, are we happy with that? And do we have the right partners?
Yeah.
And do those partners provide the correct level of quality? And it's the quality question, which is why we have a lot of in-house science in order to make it fit for purpose.
Yeah. And Paul, maybe just coming back to you, actually, you know, have you got a view of whether this is an expertise the MHRA should build its own internal expertise, or should actually rely more on external expertise?
So in general, I would lean more towards us being sort of a general enabler of things rather than narrow and deep. But the behavioural science, given how often this comes up in the patient discussions at every board meeting, I think that is one area that we need internal.
We do need some internal resource there.
Yeah.
Okay, that seems quite fit. Alison, you wanted to come in on that particular point?
Yeah, I mean, just to say that part of the problem there is data.
Yeah.
And one of the things we're trying to improve very sort of proactively is our data around devices, and to understand, you know, if it's an implantable devices, what were the elements around that procedure that might impact then on the downstream performance and safety. And that's really complex, but we are linking with numerous registries to try and bring that sort of data in and understand the quality of that data, the scale of that data, and is it sufficiently detailed. But it's an incredibly important area.
Yeah.
And the other thing is in medicines, how do you understand the adherence of patients to their medical protocols? Are they taking their medicines at the right time? All of that sort of information is very challenging to get in at a population level.
Yeah. I know there's Raj and Mercy want to come in, but Graham, I think you've got your hand up as well. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I thought there was a lot of good stuff in here, Mark, and I enjoyed reading it. I guess one of the bits I thought I'd just go into a bit more detail was about the comments around UK Centres of Excellence in Regulatory Science, which I think is a really attractive idea. And I think one way to frame some of this conversation is to think about what would be the purpose, what functions would the MHRA like those to feature? Because I think those would be the things where you could leverage internal expertise with greater external expertise, where you're not trying to build a whole centre for yourself internally, but you can do that externally. And then, you know, by comparison to that, you will have your own centres of excellence. And I think within 3.1, I think I would like to have seen a little bit more granularity as to what areas of excellence you were looking at. You know, I think laboratory science is a bit too non-specific from where I sit. And I made a sort of list which we could come back to, but you know, I think that would be different for different people. And before I let you come back, I think just in terms of things that I thought were underplayed, I also made a note about behavioural change. There were a couple I just wondered if they were on your list, was around inequalities, and that obviously cuts across a lot of areas that you've been working on, and also alternatives to animal models, which I think is an area that some regulatory authorities are working on. So I think my main question would really be around, if you were creating centres of excellence, what would they be on, and what would they be complementing in terms of your core skills?
Yeah, well, thank you, Graham. Mark?
Yes, we are very supportive of the Centres of Excellence idea that is out there. We walk a slight line, Graham, which is we don't want to be seen to be marking our own homework. And some Centres of Excellence study about how effective we are. But there's no doubt that we need to look effectively in the data area of better benchmarking for international regulation, and then various parts of the regulatory procedure, some of the impact measures. So there's a lot to do there. We have had various discussions with UKRI and other bodies who are looking around these Centres of Excellence, and I hope we can bring them to fruition.
Can I just maybe add to that in a second, because I'm just thinking back to June's point of being ambitious. I'm just wondering whether actually UK Centres of Excellence is actually ambitious enough, and whether we should be thinking about international Centres of Excellence for regulation. You know, and then it isn't quite the same as us marking our own homework, to answer your point. And it's actually about the global impact we have in the global regulatory system, perhaps. So it's just a thought.
Now that is a very good idea. As we've mentioned earlier today, we have an increasing set of international collaborations.
Exactly.
They're all going to be underpinned by research. I've already had some discussions with Switzerland and others, which we want to build into. It's not quite there yet.
No.
So if you look at, say, the EMA or the FDA, they already have established regulatory science mechanisms. We need to actually think that one through so we can show the same impact measures that they've used.
But I would have thought the Access Consortium of Australia, Canada, Singapore, Switzerland would be an ideal opportunity because we know that there's a number of like-minded ideas there.
Yeah, absolutely, fully agree.
So okay, so Raj, I think you had a point, and then I'll come to Mercy.
Thank you. Oops. I think that I just want to sort of comment on a couple of things and then a question. The behavioral science is really important because it's a growing area in multiple, nationally as well as internationally. And I think COVID triggered that to an extent because of looking at behaviors of patients. So I think that's something we should look at and bring it into scope. The piece that I really want to look at is, if research is so wide, in terms of it's too wide in some ways. So should we be looking to say, I liked the idea of the regulatory science and actually had a note to myself on integrating the regulatory science with your research and priorities in terms of looking at it. But the real goal is, if you really want to have the ambition, could we work in terms of what is the product and what is the differentiated product MHRA can offer in this space? That has to be the key. I think that's where the key question could be, where you combine regulatory science, because you have that in-house, but you also have today's tour, Mark, opened our eyes on multiple areas. So you have these unique entities that characterizes the UK MHRA that does not characterize other agencies. CPRD, your own unit here. So we might want to step back and say, okay, what have we got that's different from others?
Yeah.
And where can we connect the dots and integrate that so that we can actually offer a differentiated offering or a differentiated product? Because if we get to that point, partnerships, international partnerships would be facilitated, and that's food for thought.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, interesting. Mark?
Yes, just for the people listening, the tour was to the UK Stem Cell Bank, which is a very important resource for the advanced therapies in the UK and internationally, providing entirely well-validated stem cell lines for research and product development purposes. It is unique, and as we heard, it curates over 50% of the stem cell line, so it's an international facility. It also represents 15 to 20 years of investment and development, and so it's something to bear in mind. We have some very mature programs here, which is what I tried to capture in the long term. They are paying off, they continue to pay off, and we need to build that. But in all places, you're right, Raj. What is the product we're producing? Now you hear that, it comes through in guidelines, it comes through in reference materials, it comes through in advice, but it's also legislation at times. Some of the work we've done on medical devices and clinical trials will have significant effects. So we've got a range of products, we have to have a better definition, but I agree, we use our unique selling points on that.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's really helpful. I just realised, Mark, I cut you off when we were talking about centres of excellence. In the other half of Graham's questions around actually his comment that he thought the laboratory science was too general. Yes. And also, are there alternatives to things like animal models and other areas like that you might want to explore?
Okay, so in reverse, we are signed up to the Concordat of Openness on animal experimentation. We do, unfortunately, do some animal work for routine testing on control, but that is extremely rare now. And that's because we're signed up to the 3 R's protocol of reduction, replacement, and refinement, which we are absolutely brought in line. The animal work will continue to probably be decreasing in development, but it's always under the 3 R's rationalization. Now, that said, for the laboratory science, it was intentionally broad. We ran an analysis of the laboratory science. We've got about, let's say, 16 areas, but in this, it depends how you entitle things. So I kept it into a single box for the purposes of this paper, but we still have the idea of prioritizing, say, biotherapeutic research versus vaccinology versus chemical entity research in our BP labs.
Yeah. So I think that's probably still quite an important steer, though. That I think actually the final strategy does need to have clear prioritization. I think that becomes important. I think Graham, did you want to come back in on that, having interrupted your question being answered?
Yeah, no, it was great to hear sort of Mark talking about those, and I think we shouldn't underestimate how strong the vaccine work of MHRA is across a number of areas. And I think that's another example of something that could be brought much more front and centre as part of the strategic priorities. I mean, it's a question of presentation to some extent, but a lot of what's been in the long-term science, I think, would be captured in vaccinology too. And I think we've heard about advanced therapeutics, which I think could be more high profile, as could data science and real world evidence. And there's a balance between how many of these you want. But I would think it would feel sensible to try and promote some of those more strongly where there's clearly world-leading expertise.
Yeah, and I think actually the use of vaccines is going to expand beyond the normal therapy areas of prevention of infectious diseases, and thinking about cancer and all sorts of other areas that vaccinology could actually be extended into. So I think that could be a really fruitful area. So personally, I'm very, very keen that we do ensure vaccines are a specific area of expertise for us. It's one of the, it's back to Raj's point about what are the really unique components. CPRD we've heard of is clearly one. There's stem cell banks another. I think our vaccine expertise and biological expertise at this organisation here in South Mims is world class. So let's really, really focus on those strengths to make a distinctive offering that maybe we could then have a global or internationally recognised centre of excellence, not just a UK one. So that will be a theme. But Mercy, I know that you had a question that you wanted to ask.
Well, I was just going to comment really on what Paul was saying, so around behavioural science, that there's an awful lot out there. And certainly at least 15 years ago, we were having kind of seminars and things at NICE around the use of medicines and the use of devices. Yeah. So there's a lot of international evidence now that's built up around those things. I think there's more basic research that needs to be done in the UK. So I think we still need to understand a lot more about what happens out there. And I was wondering, first of all, around behavioural science, but then just generally having kind of advisory groups and people to, so one way of bringing in kind of people is to use some of those kind of international kind of professors and things that we used to use at NICE, and actually have had higher profile during COVID as well, so that we can use their expertise. But also just generally on science, we did have a scientific advisory group, and with people who were, kind of generally regarded in, cutting edge research as well. And I think we were talking at that stage about lay input into that too. I just wondered what happened to them, and are we going to kind of recreate them? Because I think they could give a real input and steerage to where we're going with our.
Okay, yeah, it's a good question, particularly on the scientific advisory group.
Absolutely. So we've had a recent work by Carly McGurry's team on committee review, and we have a lot of committees which could. So there's areas of perhaps refocusing to make sure we've got the right committee in place. The Scientific Advisory Committee you referred to is specifically for this site, looking at the NIBSC area. The plan there is to relaunch it. One of the challenges with these committees is to look at the diversity effect, because you get the greater value from a committee if it's got the most focused experts. So I personally favour we may need more than one committee, and that's why the committee review is important, because we understand what experts we're in. They must be experts in their field, and they must understand the agency. It's that understanding which will enable their advice to be best. And in terms of lay, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, a number of the committees we still have, such as in the animal research, have got very active lay members. We also have lay public contributing to ILAP decisions. We would look to bring it in elsewhere.
Okay, I think actually it would be helpful to have an update in terms of where we are with the review on the scientific committees. I think that would be a helpful action to probably take away from this, because it's not just around the scientific advisory committees, about all of the expert committees that we've got. I am hearing a strong sense that we do need some in-house expertise on behavioural science, and you could maybe complement that with maybe an expert group as well, perhaps, because if this is such an important area, that sort of is what I'm taking from this conversation. So Mark, does that sort of give you some further food for thought in terms of what you're looking for from the board? You're asking us to consider the outlined strategy and provide some strategic input, and to identify some priorities, which I think we've possibly done. Does that help? Is there anything else that you would like from the board today?
That helps immensely. No, I think that'll be useful. As I said, this is a work in progress. I intended to go back now and work further with our scientists in order to come up with a strategy that's really useful and fit for purpose.
Okay, and final question for me then, what's the sort of timing to actually have a sort of a strategy that we'll be able to come back to the board?
Good question. I'd like to bring it back this year if we can. So
is that this financial year, not this calendar year?
Yeah. Yeah, as opposed
is that this afternoon
then? 5 minutes time.
Here's one I prepared earlier.
No, to bring back the next development this financial year, if the board agrees.
Okay. Oh well, I think. Can I speak on behalf of the board that would be very interested to bring this to some specific priorities, because I think that will be really important, and actually it's a key part of our corporate plan, because unless it does need to be aligned with that, June, doesn't it? I think so. I think that would be helpful. So. Okay, so I think there's a specific action around the update on the committee reviews. I think the science strategy coming back to the board by the end of this financial year. I think that was a request there, which I think would be pretty content to be able to do. Got to work out the scheduling, but I think we can sort that out offline. But thank you, Mark, to you and the team. I think that's good food for thought. Okay, so we can note the report with thanks. So that takes us on to the next item. And again, we should be able to have another guest being able to join us. I think if the technical team can promote Phil onto the screen, that would be great. Alison, we're going to be talking this time about Safety Connect, another of our major investments to do with delivering comprehensive and responsive safety surveillance. Phil, we can see you on the screen. Can you hear us? Can we just check with that? Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Chair. My name is Phil Trigano. I'm Deputy Director for Patient Safety Monitoring in Safety and Surveillance.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us this morning. Alison, is there any sort of introductory comments you'd like to make first, just by way of this? Is page 64 in the board pack?
Yes. No, just to say that this, of course, we've talked a lot about Safety Connect over numerous meetings, and I think this just provides the board with an update on where we are, the progress and the next steps, but specifically in response to the Cumberledge report, gives Phil's going to go over some of the sort of patient-fronted enhancements, the things that patients will see when they come in to submit their report, and how we look in the future to feed more information back to those patients who are willing to receive it, but also how we can amend the reports as new safety issues arise and we want to seek specific information. But Phil is the expert, so I'll pass over to him in case he has any additional comments.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Phil. I know we did toy with the idea of doing a live demonstration, but we chickened out, I think it's fair to say. But it might be just helpful, Phil, just from your perspective, as you've been so intimately involved with this program, just to explain a little bit more about how this works.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the challenges with doing a live demonstration was that a lot of the work that we've done has been on the back end of the system to enable us to continue to provide very simple forms to individuals on the front end. And therefore, perhaps you don't see the full extent of the capability that we have by simply doing a demonstration of the front end tools. So I guess the easiest place to show some of the work we've been able to do is in the annexes in the paper. So I'd like to draw your attention to those. And I think in doing that, highlight also that all of the functionality that we're describing has been developed in consultation with the various stakeholder groups, but particularly with members of the public, to understand their needs and how they would like us to develop the surveillance system. What you can see in those annexes is our new ability to be able to develop customized forms to address specific situations. So whilst in the front end, a user will continue to see a very simple a web-based or app-based form, we can actually derive specific questions depending on the type of product or the type of individual who is reporting to us. And therefore we can use specific conditions and cohorts to enable us to provide specific and customized questions to address needs arising for a particular product. That specifically means that we can use our risk management planning activities to address questions from very early on in the pharmacovigilance or vigilance process for either medicines or medical devices. So we can collect data faster and better quality data to address specific questions that we may have identified through the risk management planning cycle. I think the other area that I'd like to emphasize is that this also gives us the ability to pivot from a passive surveillance model where we would normally use yellow card into a more active engagement model, meaning that we can conduct longer term follow-up with individuals in relation to specific conditions, or even active surveillance if we would like to pre-register people for specific groups of products of interest. So we now have very flexible tools to enable us to collect robust and high quality data that we can then complement with the data that we get from electronic healthcare records, such as that within CPRD, through our signal management and signal detection processes, which are also highlighted in the paper. I won't say any more now, but obviously very happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you for making what's a really complex area really clear, Phil. So I appreciate your time on that. Colleagues, who'd like to kick us off with a question or two around Safety Connect? This is a program we've been talking about for some time. It's a major investment for proactive surveillance, and in clear response to the Cumberledge Review, as Alison said. So, Mandy, were you going to ask something?
Yeah, a couple of things. And again, it's made significant progress. And I think really what this seems to me is opening up opportunities as well for the future, which you talked about. One of the thoughts I'd like to understand a little bit more is that sort of active surveillance and how that is then fed back into the way we maybe regulate new medicines on things like conditional approvals, and how that data, we're encouraging that data we have to be used by industry and researchers as either in clinical trials to work that through, because we've actually got a lot more data than perhaps typically is used in the development of a new medicine. So I think in terms of really understanding how we begin to integrate that to give us maybe different mechanisms for regulating new medicine.
Okay. Phil, do you want to sort of talk about the linkage there with actually how we then apply this in a regulatory setting?
Yeah, thank you. Clearly, our ability to collect data earlier gives us an opportunity to then make products available earlier and potentially in a more phased way to different cohorts. And clearly, that's a benefit to patient groups. All of the data that we collect through Yellow Card is made available to industry in line with our data sharing policy, and there's a legislative requirement for us to do so, to enable them to have access and make appropriate safety assessments. And clearly that data can be used in that way. Of course, the interesting thing with active surveillance is that we do have a robust denominator, and therefore we would need to think specifically in the circumstances where we were deploying that methodology about the right ways to engage with industry around that data. But the intention absolutely is it can be used in the ways described.
Okay, great, thank you. Raj, this is an area that is normally of interest to you.
I had a very similar question to Mandy. Clearly a lot of progress has been made in this area as well. But both as a patient and as a board member, I would like to just ask, what is the biggest value? If there was one item you would say Safety Connect is delivering to us as a value item as a patient, Phil, what would that be?
That's a great question. I think for me, the most important aspect, and the bit that we've heard loudest and clearest through the Cumberledge Review, is our ability to engage with individuals and our ability, therefore, to collect specific information related to conditions as they arise through the medicine's life cycle, but also to use the platforms that we have to communicate information back to stakeholders is critical. So for me, I think the front end systems and our improved engagement capabilities are probably the area that I would highlight. But of course, that all of that communication activity that we've highlighted in the paper will become possible is only possible because of the robust and enhanced signal detection tools that we are deploying. And so it is really a whole package of information, of tools that enables us to have that capability. And I think our ability through the Safety Connect program to have robust signal detection that is stratified across and different methodologies applied for different types of products, then give us the ability to provide much better information that detect safety issues earlier. So there is a whole plethora of information, but I think the important element from a patient and stakeholder side is the improved tools on the front end for data collection.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Alison, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, I mean, what will facilitate reporting and that is ease of reporting.
Yeah.
So having a really nice experience when you come in to report an adverse event or an adverse reaction, but also then to understand a little bit more of the impact of that report. And that's one of the things that we're looking to do also through this process, that they can follow up and understand more where that report went, so providing that journey. But I think also that opportunity, as Phil highlighted, to have a dialogue. Patients can follow particular products. That enables us to indicate when there is a safety issue or a change in a medicine, the way it used, or a device. And I think this new platform will also provide a real step change in device reporting and device analysis. So I think that that's a key action. Not all of that will be seen by the patient, but certainly the facilitated reporting and the understanding of where their report went will be enhanced.
That's very helpful. I'll come to Hader in a moment, but June, do you want
I was
to...
just going to pick up on the device side, and Alison's mind is working in the same way. If there's anything more you want to say about how that will be landing with the public to make sure that there's that step change that Alison's talked about. Can you link that with transparency and when, as in Cumberledge, people will be able to see the adverse events with devices? And then finally, if there's a moment, I know we're working in an agile way, but is there a moment we could, if you like, mark this in some way? Because it is a huge step forward.
Yeah. A few questions there. Phil, do you want to try and respond to those?
Yeah, so first of all, in terms of devices, the functionality around collection of data for devices is identical to that for medicines that is shown on the screenshots. So we absolutely have that same capability. The area that we haven't historically been able to do so well with collection of devices is around integration into other systems. And specifically, we know that in the primary care systems, there's much less data around medical devices than there is around medicines. And so these tools do give us the ability, using the application programming interfaces, to connect the yellow card into these third-party systems. And I think that is going to be a really important area, particularly in the medical devices space, whether it's collection to registries or others. The transparency point is also really important. You'll see some screenshots from our early development cycle within the paper, highlighting the enhanced data visualization capability that we're bringing forward with Safety Connect. The examples there are for vaccines, which will be live by the end of this year. However, we are then bringing forward the work on transparency of devices elements in line with the next phase of the Safety Connect program, which will follow on after the deployment of our main safety database activities for medicines by the end of the financial year is the intention, and the device transparency elements following on after that. So it's very much on the roadmap, and all of these visualizations are a part of the journey which will bring us to be able to display data on all medicinal products through that same visualization approach. And you'll note that we include also a safety assessment box there, which will give us the capability to provide specific messages from the signal detection, signal management system directly to stakeholders. So a large amount of work being done across different areas, but the intention is that that becomes applicable to all products through the programme.
And I don't think we should underplay the significance of actually doing this for devices. This is a quantum leap ahead. This is not just a small step. This is massive. And I think congratulations that the vision to actually start bringing together the expertise across all of these different product groups into a single vigilance platform, I think is fantastic. So massive congratulations there, Phil. Hader, I think you had a question.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, I was also going to congratulate Phil on Halo, hopefully going live successfully next week, which I think will be a really, really big milestone. And there's probably a lot to do with Claire's team as well. I also really welcome the move from passive to active surveillance monitoring. And the question really was about the integration between the NHS app and Safety Connect. How deep do you think that will go, and how will we manage the user experience between those two apps?
Thank you. We've had some fairly extensive discussions with NHS, well, what was NHS X NHSD, around what that integration looks like, and have begun that integration pathway. The first step is to use NHS login, which would then give us the capability for people who have registered, so the near 50% of the population that are registered to use the NHS app, to use the yellow card with the same login details. But one of the benefits that would also give is the ability to use NHS numbers to link data between the electronic healthcare record system and the yellow card. That, of course, also gives us the ability to then use application program interfaces for a deeper integration between the NHS app and the yellow card. And that can be anything from a simple handover of credentials to a deeper integration that passes information, of course, where there has been appropriate approval from the individual, that data can be transferred from one system to another to ease the reporting flow and to reduce the amount of information that people have to input manually. I think your question started off around the active surveillance elements, and the area that we probably require further discussion is around some of the novel products and ensuring that people can register prior to receipt of those products, because for active surveillance we'd want to register people prior to the use of the product. That, I suspect, we understand at this stage is likely to be very heavily influenced by the access pathway for the individual product. So it's likely to be something that we would need to do on an individual product basis, but it's something that we can look at through the regulatory approval process to ensure that we are best placed to be able to integrate in that way.
Just picking up on the information governance piece, you think about the NHS app linkage there. Are you thinking of an opt-in or an opt-out model? So, that people have to actively opt out, and if they don't, information will be automatically transferred? Or will it be an opt-in model where you've actually got to persuade every individual person to tick a box to say, yes, they can share data?
So there's a few different elements to this, and it also depends on the level of access that people have agreed with the NHS app itself. There are 3 different levels of access through NHS login. There is the deepest level, which where people have approved third-party systems can access elements of their healthcare record. There is a higher level where it is in essence geographic type, not geographic data, but high level administrative type data in relation to an individual status. And there is the lowest level where people have in essence said that they can have a username to effectively, it was the access to test kits and so on for COVID-19. So there are different levels that have been predefined when people register for the NHS app, that would enable them would determine the level of data that could be shared with us. We wouldn't clearly want to be in a situation of obtaining data where people were not aware of it. So there is also important privacy considerations and relevant notices that would need to be applied. But we'd also want to have the smoothest integration that we could do, so where people were comfortable with that and had signed up to it, that integration could be as as simple as possible. So there are a number of different considerations, but they've been very well thought through from an NHS perspective as to how the access models are defined.
Yeah, it's a complex environment. I'm just thinking that, particularly for, if you tick in a box for third-party access, you wouldn't necessarily think that was for safety monitoring. You'd think that was for commercial gain. And it doesn't, I suppose that's the only sort of wrinkle I see in that approach, if I'm honest, Phil. Just thinking from my NHS hat on here as well. But yeah, I think we'll have to be obviously compliant from an IG perspective, but I think that's still worth exploring it to ensure that we can maximise the amount of data we can bring in. And the NHS app the NHS is determined that it becomes a major source of access to NHS services. So that will only grow in future, and it seems like a really good data source. But I know, Claire, you wanted to make a point.
I did, and June's comment about a particular date did make me smile, because I know a couple of us have got champagne on ice ready for a particular any excuse. However, once we've had our glass of fizz, it's back to what I was saying before about keeping our foot on the gas. And what I'm thinking about now is sustaining and maintaining this. So we've talked about NHS app and the degree to which, the extent to which this might integrate with that, but that's not the only show in town, and we don't know what will happen in future in the health ecosystem. So again, thinking about the technology, keeping it refreshed and modern and flexible enough to be able to react to whatever comes our way, but also from a user experience perspective. So there are a lot of products and technology that make up Safety Connect and a lot of vendors and suppliers. So just having that big, robust support wrap, I suppose, first line, second line, etc., and making sure we always have the people, processes and technology to maintain that user experience, and making sure that what we're creating now, not to take the shine off this huge achievement, we're keeping an eye on making sure it doesn't become a legacy product of the future. So that's, glass of champagne, and away we go onto the next sort of challenge and phase of this solution.
Well, I'm quite reassured by that, because that was going to be one of my questions, was actually what next. It's not that I'm at all disrespectful about the enormity of what we've just achieved, or we're just about to achieve, but the reality is we need to keep it fresh. We need to keep evolving it. It needs to stay relevant. So, okay, Paul, final question from you, and then we'll need to move on.
Yeah, it's probably less a question than sort of thinking about future things to talk about, because this is just so important, and other things that can be done. And there's the identifying new risks that occur, but it's also the potential to weed out all of those things which are currently listed in patient leaflets that are erroneous. And it frustrates me every time I open up those packs and read it, and it says there's a 1 in 10 risk of back pain with, and patients will believe that. And it's often a false association. And so I think we could really improve patient understanding by getting a better handle on how things actually perform. And then it's closing that gap between efficacy and effectiveness. If you have that real world data, then that can also lead to helping with Catherine's work on health economics. And so how much benefit are patients actually getting from their medication?
Okay. So thank you for that, Paul, because I think that was more of a comment than a question. But Alison, any sort of final closing remarks you'd like to make?
Yes, I mean, in response to that, and what we haven't picked up on is the analytical capabilities that that the platform will bring us, enable us to look across products in a much more efficient and analytical way than we can. Look for heat maps, look for word clouds from the narratives, really try and understand more about how a product is performing, and understand, which products do have, the event of back pain, and which actually, when you look at a heat map across products, don't have it. Getting the evidence to take something out of an SMP or out of a pill is always very challenging, but something that with this platform we can start to look at. I think the only thing I would point at, sort of emphasize, is our ambition here. This isn't the end, this is sort of the beginning, because it gives us a platform to build on. And one of the things we're really keen to do is to try and reduce duplicative reporting. We hear that very much in the device world. So how can we better integrate with existing hospital services and facilitate that reporting for all healthcare professionals, patients and the public? And I think that's where our ambition sits. And that will require APIs, integration, and all of that technology, which I think this gives us a basis for.
Great. Okay, well, thank you, Alison. Thank you very much, Phil, to you and the team. I know it's been a massive team effort, so I think our congratulations should go to the entire team that have been involved in this. This has been a long time coming, you know, a lot of work and a lot of dedication, so really, really appreciate that. I think the board can, you know, we should record our thanks and congratulations and note the progress that's been made. I'm really excited about the continued evolution of this. This is not a one-off. It needs to continue to evolve. So I think that becomes the interesting point for the future. It's a real world leading piece of work, this. So thank you very much. Okay, thank you, Phil. Have a good day for the rest of the day. So that brings us on to two short assurance reports, if that's okay. So first of all, Mandy, there's a joint committee of the Organisational Development and Remuneration Committee, which we call ODRC for short, and the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee, which we call ARAC for short. You can assume the paper's been read, but any points you wanted to bring to the board's attention in your report on page 72?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I think it was really important that ARAC and ODRC met together, particularly as we're looking about one agency and how the agency works together. And I think it's really important the committees also lead by example. So I think the paper's fairly self-explanatory on what we reviewed. And I'll probably just go to the concluding remarks, really. I think we were encouraged by the progress that's being made. And I think particularly seeing the collaboration between how we deliver our services and how that's how the technology will help that to happen. So the discovery phase, there's lots of buzzwords, but about is genuinely how getting people working together, both from Claire's team and from Laura's team. And I think that is absolutely fundamental as we're changing our operating model. It's also fair to say that we're designing these processes and systems, but with an eye to the future. So for instance, we don't know the extent of devices legislation at the moment, but it's really important that that is integrated into the regulatory management system. So it's not going to be perfect on day one. And I think when we talked about Safety Connect, some of that learning is really important, but there is going to be a progression of how this works going forward. So I think that's important for us to understand. We talked about risk and governance. The project appears to have a strong governance process through a project board and through the processes that are being run to give assurance. We realise there is still risk associated with these complex projects, but the right things are in place and being actively done. It doesn't appear to be box ticking. It appears to be genuine discussion around how we address those risks. Claire talked earlier about the minimal viable product. So if you like, this is again be a really important milestone. And it's, you know, there are risks associated with what that delivers and how much, but I think the project is on track to deliver that, and that will help us build and develop the ways of working and understand what needs to be done in the future. So I think ARAC and ODRC will continue to seek assurance from the programme, both from in terms of the services and how that's and the people employed to do that, but also in terms of the technology project and spend and delivery.
Okay, thank you for that. I think that's very comprehensive, and actually it's a useful additional insight there. Obviously, you know, every project has risks, so I think that's just a reality. So it's not as though it's unusual to the MHRA in that sense, but I think it is important to say that, you know, they're being well managed, and that's the message I've just heard from you, Mandy. Colleagues, are there any other specific questions, or was that relatively understandable and clear? I'm not seeing any questions, but I think that's a very strong form of assurance. So actually, I'm personally very, very gratified for the work that you did. I'm glad the joint committee working has helped there. But I think there's a strong level of assurance there, and good luck to the project teams to continue that progress. Okay, so let's note the report with thanks. And then the final report is then an assurance report from the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee, this time on your own, Michael. So yeah, you work independently and you work in collaboration.
Thank you, Chair. I again will take the paper as read, but I'll just highlight there were 3 issues I was going to highlight. One related to financial performance, but I think we touched on that or dealt with that when we discussed the delivery plan. The other 2 areas, first is health and safety, where we spend a lot of time looking at the results of the recent Health and Safety Executive Report. We're assured that the recommendations from that report are being taken very seriously by the agency. But we met over 2 weeks ago, so in a minute it might be helpful for Mark to update us as to where we are on that. And my third point, if that's the right one, really relates to internal audit. And it's a bit of a moan from me here, but it's a legitimate moan, I think. Internal audit is a really important part of the independent assurance to the accounting officer. And I think there is a pattern at ARAC. We are promised internal audit reports. I don't set the timetable for when they are coming to ARAC, but I would say for at least the last 3 meetings, internal audit reports have been delayed. Now, partly that I think may be due to resources that internal audit they've not delivered, and I will be a hard taskmaster on them where that is the case. But equally, there's a slight underfeeling that internal audit is not taken sufficiently seriously by the agency, and I think we have to recognise that they do add value, and as an organisation, we can be demanding of them. If they're not delivering the insights that the executive and more junior people within the organisation are expecting, they should challenge them. But I would emphasise it is really, really important that internal audit is responded to effectively. Where we are at the moment is we are more than halfway through the financial year, and I haven't had any internal audit reports to consider for this year yet, which is a little bit unprecedented in my experience. ARAC is meeting again. We had to have a meeting that wasn't scheduled in December, and we're taking 3 reports on ILAP, financial control and payroll. Payroll in particular, I don't understand why that's been delayed. It's a basic fundamental function of any organisation. It should have been delivered on time. I appreciate the priorities and the pressures on people, but we do need to take internal audit a little bit more seriously than we do at the moment. Stephen, those are my points.
Well, thank you for that, Michael. Let's pick up the 2 issues that you've raised, and health and safety. I know a lot of work is going on, but Mark, can you give us an update and give us additional assurance of how we're addressing the health and safety issues?
Thank you, Chair. So we take health and safety extremely seriously as an agency. The safety of our staff and the safety of the public through our actions is paramount. So we have had a couple of riddle reports this year, which have been fully investigated and are being enacted on. They reflect both the way that the facilities are managed as well as the training of the staff. We've put in place a particular action group now to work through that, bearing in mind that, as we've raised elsewhere, we've been doing a lot of recruitment. We have staff in place who have not necessarily been in the role a lengthy period of time. So we're making sure they're also fully trained. And we were looking at the facilities and whether we have all these resources correctly distributed on maintenance to make them safe. What I want to emphasize is that for every activity, the agency performs a risk assessment first. And if the risks cannot be properly controlled, then we will not start. So we work tirelessly to make sure that this is a safe agency.
Great. Okay. So that feels, sounds like you're very confident that we're addressing the issues that have been raised.
I am.
Perfect. Okay. Coming to Michael's second point then, if I may, which was then just thinking around, use of internal audit. I think, Michael, you've made your feelings very clear there. June, just thinking of from an executive perspective, what can we do in terms of actually ensuring that internal audit is seen as a force for good, as Michael describes it, and that actually reports are acted on appropriately and quickly.
I would say it is seen as a force for good, but in different degrees. Timing and the nature of the areas selected is really important for us to drive that appreciation. I would say that there is a change in leadership within our own governance, and also there has been a change in leadership in internal audit. And working with that new lead, we're refocusing on perhaps a smaller number of audits rather than the very wide net that was cast before. The one way to get embedded in thinking is that it's not just willy-nilly that we do audits. They're done because we really need those findings and we're going to act on them. So I would see it being a smaller number, but greater depth. And in that way, we will get that engagement and seriousness that it deserves. So it's been, if you like, a fallow period, but I think we're about to see ramping up. And I think, Chair, Stephen, your point is to make sure that we're acting and being seen to drive out the value. Really important reports. We've had governance, ILAPs coming up, and then there are the financial ones. Individually expected to give us really important findings that we will be driving forward.
And of course, they will then feed into the annual governance statement that will be in the annual report to give confidence that we've got good governance and controls over our organisation. So it does become vitally important. It's all part of the picture. So, okay. Colleagues, is there anything else that anybody wanted to specifically raise? Mercy?
Yes, just 6.4. I'm the Raising Concerns champion on the board. To say that there's been, I think last week or the week before, there's been more publicity promoting the fact that, you know, that people, if they've got concerns, they should kind of bring it up and bring it forward. And I'd emphasise it, especially to the staff listening, that they do that. And I'm the kind of the independent person on the board. So if they feel they can't do it through the systems we have in place, they can come direct to me.
It's really important that staff who've got concerns do raise them. I think we cannot emphasise that enough. So thank you for making that point, Mercy. Okay, so on that basis, I think with the comments, additional comments that we've just received from Mark and June, can we therefore just take Michael's report and note it with thanks? But again, let's just keep working through that, and we look forward to the results of the internal audits after your next meeting, Michael. So thank you for that. Good. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the papers on the board meeting. Now comes to my favourite part of the board meeting, in fact, actually. So, Rachel, can I check if we've got any questions from members of the public?
Yes, we've had quite a number of comments and questions and points raised from members of the public through the meeting. So I've pulled out half a dozen questions, including 2 of the pre-submitted ones that range across a number of the topics on the agenda.
Okay, so we're talking 6 questions. That would be great. So the first question then, let's go straight into it.
Yeah, so the first question is one of the pre-submitted ones. And just to say, we've had another one come through the chat function that's quite linked. So you might want to take those 2 together, as I think they'll both be for Alison. So the first one is, how does the Safety Connect system identify safety signals? Hundreds of researchers around the world have identified and reported on adverse events from COVID vaccines, but the MHRA has apparently not detected any safety signals. How is this possible? And as I say, that's one of the pre-submitted questions.
Okay, Alison, do you want to help us with that?
So I'll take that. And obviously the board and members listening and people listening have heard about Safety Connect today. And today we focused much more on the front end of the system and some of the technology. We didn't discuss the signal detection process, which will be considerably enhanced through the new platform. But just as a quick synopsis, what we're trying to do, obviously, with spontaneous reporting is to identify any new adverse events, but also any change in adverse events already identified. And that might be adverse reports or adverse events from devices. So what we do is we do apply statistical methods onto our data so that we can understand whether these events are happening more frequently than we would expect in the general population. So really to look at that observed versus expected ratio. And we do that based on a number of data sources which we bring in and look. And through the COVID-19 vaccines, which was also highlighted in the question, we did that in a very proactive, real-time basis, looking in a weekly basis. What was the observed, what was the expected ratio of any signal that we detected? We also try to look at the clinical characteristics of any signal that we're seeing to see if there are new patterns of illness emerging that would indicate a potential new safety concern. And we bring in other sources, studies globally, as well as other data released from other regulatory authorities. So it's a very comprehensive process, looking holistically at a signal and trying to understand whether this is a real new or changed signal, or whether it's something that is really just coincident with the taking of a medicine or use of a device. I would just like to emphasize that, of course, through the COVID-19 pandemic, we regularly and continuously assess safety signals, and all of those safety signals, not true to say MHRA did not detect any safety signals. There is a really substantial report on our website, which through the COVID pandemic was updated regularly with all of the data that we were assessing, all of our analysis of that data, and all of the contextualization of the data, which I would like to point the questioner to.
Yeah. And I think in addition to that, that data was shared with other international regulators.
Absolutely.
So it wasn't even kept in the UK. This was shared internationally, and has actually been a huge body of evidence to support the safe use of these vaccines around the world.
Yeah, and we've been very transparent, and we've regularly published that on our website.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful, Alison. So your next question then.
Yes.
Was this related to Safety
Yes,
Connect?
it's also about yellow card reporting and came about as part of the Safety Connect discussion earlier. So the question is, how are yellow card reports followed up, and how do you connect with patients who've suffered a severe adverse reaction?
So we follow up on individual report where there are gaps that in that data that wouldn't enable us to evaluate the issue completely. We routinely follow up all fatal reports, but as the Safety Connect platform was illustrated, it will now enable us to have a much more regular follow-up with larger groups, and the technology also will allow us to schedule that for registered users. So it's a real key advance in the new Safety Connect platform, but it has been all fatal reports have been regularly followed up in the past.
Okay. Thank you very much. Were we expecting a member of the public to actually, who's given their consent to appear on screen?
Yes, we are. I think we're just going to bring them in.
I think Janine Jameson. I think it's just Janine. Good afternoon. Hello. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for giving us your consent to ask your question online. Would you just like to explain who you are and what your affiliation is, and then ask your question, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you for taking my question. My name is Ginny Jameson, and I'm European editor for a publication called International Pharmaceutical Quality. So my question was, first of all, to acknowledge the really at the start of the meeting about international collaboration. There's some fantastic things going on, and it was great to hear that June was at the ICMRA meeting recently. So I just wanted to ask about engagement of assessors and inspectors at international conferences, because in terms of quality and inspection of medicines and manufacture, MHRA have always had quite a leading role at conferences, and it's a little bit quieter now. So particularly in terms of drugs and advanced therapy medicines and biologics. I'd just like to hear from the board about support for MHRA to take part in these meetings in the future.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Janine. June, why don't I come to you in the first instance?
Well, thank you for your question, and it really is important to us to make sure that we do have this international influence because of the incredible expertise and experience we have to offer. The point you've made about it may have been a bit quiet. Clearly, we've been working hard and are now full members of the International Conference on Harmonisation. It's happening this week in Korea. That's really important to us. And also the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum. So it's, again, getting back that foothold that we used to share as members of the European network. In terms of actual deliverables, and you're right to mention the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities last week, that has a really important initiative, Product Quality Knowledge Management System, if I've got it right, PQKMS, where our inspectors are fully involved. And that will begin to deliver what we've dreamed about for a long time, which is this internationally accessible repository of quality information. So I hope that's one key example that assures you that our voices are there, working with the FDA and quite a number of other international authorities. But there is more to do, and you mentioned advanced therapies and so forth. I think we're continuing to seek out those fora where we can add value, but it's well underway now, and I think you'll be hearing a lot more.
Yeah. So it's been a really important point of the agency's history. Now we've come out of Europe to be a member of all the major international coalition groups. I think your question, if I'm correct, Ginny, was also asking specifically about assessors. I was wondering, Laura, in terms of your sort of perspective, in terms of our assessors actually having opportunity to attend international congresses and participate and contribute.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a conversation we've just had at our senior management team, actually, because there are some sort of dull prioritizations that you have to do. You know, what's in the budget, what time, and all of that sort of thing. But I've actually just had that conversation with all of the assessors to say, at this point to the end of the year, you should have an idea of where you're intending to go. Yeah. So we brought all that together at our last meeting to have a conversation about, okay, so what do we actually prioritize? And we are starting to do that. And I'm pleased to say that everything people brought that they wanted to do before the end of the year, we are going to support. So we are starting to do that. It has to be tied in. You know, I talked earlier about bringing in 8 new assessors, bringing in another 6. They all require training and resource, and that requires those assessors. But at the same time, I think there are benefits for the world of us being involved, but there are benefits for the assessors themselves. And I want them to, we need to start refocusing. Now we're coming out of the dip of transformation on how personal development of them as well, and how we can marry those things together to get international representation. So I agree with June's statement that we're starting to build. There's more to come.
Yeah. And I think the other thing I would also add, if our Chief Partnerships Officer had been here, we've got a whole series of international programs of work there as well. And there's an opportunity for other members of staff, not just board members, to be involved in that work as well. So I think at multiple levels, Janine, I think there are opportunities here. We want to play a role on the global stage, I think it's fair to say. So that would be my perspective. Does that answer your question?
It does, thank you. Thank you for bringing in the conferences to just talk about how MHRA is involved, to let everybody know what's happening. And just to mention, I think resources is often brought up at conferences for all regulatory agencies, how to manage that. So it is a challenge, but it's great to hear. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for your interest, and thank you for your question, Janine. So have a good day. Okay. Rachel, another question, please.
Yeah, so the next one is about MHRA funding, and that came about as a result of the balanced scorecard statistics that showed 70% of the agency's funding is from industry. And the questioner asked, how can this be allowed to happen if the MHRA is aiming for impartiality?
Okay, a very important question on independence. June, can I maybe ask you to start that?
Yes, regulators are generally able to recover the costs of what they do from the regulated sector. Even if you apply for a driving license and pay the tester, he's not going to be biased by that. So it is a fundamental principle. Clearly, we have checks and balances that make sure that independent judgments are exactly what they are, and we have really carefully constructed confidentiality conflicts of interest policy. So I hope that does reassure that we're doing what regulators do and maintaining independence at the same time.
Yeah, so gaining a fee, quite specifically, does not guarantee that you'll get a positive opinion. I think that's the
driving test.
that is really the important point. But maybe again, just to give some a little additional assurance, Raj, you're one of our non-executive directors, and you used to work in regulatory functions in pharmaceutical industries. What's the industry perspective on this in terms of having to pay fees to the MHRA? Does that compromise their independence?
I think firstly, it's not a unique practice of the MHRA.
Correct.
All regulators throughout the world do and will charge fees in that context. So I think I need to make that clear. From an industry perspective, the conflict of interest is actually managed by what you said earlier, Stephen. The outcome of the review, what you're paying is for the process of the review. The outcome of the review will always remain independent of what you have paid. It is what we always typically say in industry, back it up with evidence. So outcome is evidence-based and your fees is really for the process. So I think from an industry perspective, don't see this, it's just a normal way of doing business at the end of the day in terms of it. The conflict, I just want to bring in the what was touched on. I think the conflict of interest is actually managed by the process of how the review is done. That's how it's managed by independent advisory committees, experts being brought in, it's that entire process behind the review procedure that reassures you and manages the conflict of interest. But fees for filing from an industry perspective, that's a standard, no matter where you go.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the other point I'd just make is that there are a whole series of checks and balances on conflicts of interest, and the decisions are recommended to ministers who do make the final decision. So it's ministers that make the final decision, not just the MHRA. Independent civil servants are part of that process, and then we also have the layer of independent scientific committees providing the advice. So I think there's multiple layers of protection here to ensure that there isn't undue influence to achieve a positive response purely because a fee has been paid. So the fee is for the process, not for the decision. And I think that's how we'd probably conclude on that point. But thank you for the question. Rachel.
Yeah, and the next question picks up some points about consultations. And the question is asking, is there any news on the MHRA point of care manufacturing consultation yet?
Okay, maybe Laura, could I maybe just come to you on that one?
Yes, I can take that one. So we've done the consultation and we've done the analysis of the consultation responses. But I feel like I'm having a conversation I've heard earlier in the year. Before we put a consultation out, we have to do a right round across government to make sure everything is lined up. So this is at the stage of being in the government process, but we would expect to have something out fairly soon on that.
Okay, so very much in process, I think is the response. Thank you, Rachel. What is this, the last one?
Thank you. And yes, this would be the last question, and this relates to the science strategy. So the questioner is asking whether patients, the public and carers have been involved in the science strategy to enable scientific innovation. And if not, how will you assure yourselves on the perspectives held by users of medicines, medical devices and blood products in terms of science?
Okay, well, I might come back to you, to Rachel, on that as well, but why don't I ask Mark to kick us off?
Well, thank you very much for the question. The answer is yes. As I mentioned earlier, the science strategy is something that the agency has been working on for quite some time and from a diversity of areas. And it is supporting how we develop those areas, and a number of those areas have consulted with patients either on episodically or in ongoing ways to feed into it. So we are absolutely committed as an agency to patient consultation, and so there it is in place. We need to actually continue to do that. We highlighted in the Q&A just now that we will be looking at lay members. We're also looking at other ways to make sure that the science strategy does get that patient perspective. And also it's worth mentioning that this is part of our wider engagement with the patient. We've mentioned this today in terms of the Cumberledge inquiry, and making sure that the patient is involved in everything we do.
Yeah, because I think there are two components here, aren't there? Because there's the independent input on our own internal science strategy, but then there's also the involvement of patients more widely across science generally and in medicines and medical devices and blood products more widely. And Rachel, is there anything else you would like to add in terms of, we've got our patient involvement strategy, just anything else you want to add around how we are engaging patients?
Yes, certainly. And on the specific point about the science strategy, we'll be working with Mark and his team as that strategy is built out to ensure we bring patient voice in. And more widely, just to say that we'll soon be publishing an update on our first year of implementing our patient involvement strategy and the progress that that's made. So Mercy's committee will be looking at that shortly, and then we'll be publishing that.
Yeah, and Mercy, as the chair of the Patient Safety and Engagement Committee, I'm sure you're going to keep an eye on the development of the science strategy.
I certainly am.
No, exactly. So I think this is really important that we continue to engage, widely with stakeholders, not just patients, but also other stakeholders who are involved in our systems to get the right decisions made. Okay, that's the conclusion of the questions. What I can say to anybody else who has either submitted a question in advance or also submitted another question on chat that wasn't directly related to today's agenda, you will get a written response within the next 18 days. So thank you very much for your interest. So, colleagues, I think that's bringing us to the end of this particular meeting. So I think that concludes not only the questions, but I would just like to thank everybody for your contribution today here in the room. Also, our visiting guests who are online, thank you to those too. And very much also a big thank you to everyone who's helped to prepare both the papers for today and also the input on the meeting today. I think the staff in the MHRA do an amazing job day in, day out, and I cannot overestimate our thanks to the incredible breadth and experience and skill that our staff bring to work every day. And that's because actually we've got a very clear purpose as the MHRA, and that's to protect and improve public and patient health. We'll continue to do that by enabling scientific innovation. We want to accelerate patient access to new, to safe products. I think that becomes really vitally important. And we'll continue, as we've seen today, strengthening our safety and surveillance systems to ensure that products that are being used safely and are having the desired impact. So with that in mind, I'd just like to say again, thank you for your attention today. I'll now close the meeting and to wish you all a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.